There is a stretch of water in the South Pacific that sailors learned to fear before they learnt its name. A narrow corridor of dark sea, flanked on both sides by jungle islands that absorbed radar signals and swallowed sound. A place where the ocean floor had already collected more steel than most navies float in a lifetime. The Americans who were sent there in the summer of 1943 called it the slot. They said the name, the way you say something, you have stopped trying to explain to people who have never seen it. Every night, almost without fail, ships came down that corridor from the north. Fast ships. Japanese destroyers running at speeds that seemed impossible for vessels of their size, carrying drums of food and ammunition lashed to their decks. Their crews trained to a level of night combat proficiency that the United States Navy had spent the better part of a year learning to respect the hard way. The Americans had a name for this operation too. They called it the Tokyo Express, and by the late summer of 1943, that name carried a particular weight. It was not quite a joke, though it had started as one. It had become something more complicated than that, something closer to a reckoning. This is the story of one night that changed what the word reckoning meant. The 6th of August, 1943. Vella Gulf, Central Solomons. 6 American destroyers waiting in the dark. 4 Japanese destroyers sailing south with absolute confidence, because confidence was something the Tokyo Express had earned, battle by battle, through more than a year of operations in these waters. The Japanese column did not know the Americans were there. The Americans, guided by radar screens their enemy could not see and did not yet fully understand, knew almost exactly where the Japanese were, where they were going, and how long they had before those ships would be in range. What happened next lasted, in its most violent form, only a matter of minutes. 3 Japanese destroyers would be gone before their crews fully understood they were under attack, not damaged, not driven off. Gone. And when the sun came up over the Solomon Islands the following morning, not a single American ship had been scratched. Not a single American sailor had been killed in the engagement itself. In a campaign that had consumed ships and men at a rate that numbed the imagination, the outcome was almost incomprehensible. But here is the thing about the Battle of Vella Gulf that makes it worth more than 2 hours of your time tonight. It was not just a victory, it was a proof. It was the moment when everything the United States Navy had been trying to figure out about destroyer warfare in the Pacific, every painful lesson bought with the lives of sailors at Savo Island and Tassafaronga, and half a dozen engagements that history has largely forgotten, crystallized into a single, clean, overwhelming demonstration of what the right tactics, the right commander, and the right technology could accomplish in the dark. The Navy had been humiliated in these waters, more than once, by a force it outnumbered, by an enemy whose equipment, in several critical respects, was genuinely superior. The long-lance torpedo that Japanese destroyers carried was a weapon American naval planners had not believed was possible, and they had paid for that disbelief in steel and blood. American commanders had fought cautious battles when they should have fought bold ones, and bold battles when they should have been cautious. Their own torpedoes had malfunctioned at critical moments. Their doctrine, written for a different kind of war, had been applied to this one without enough thought and not enough flexibility. All of that is part of this story, because you cannot understand what Commander Frederick Moosbrugger achieved in Vella Gulf without understanding what his predecessors had failed to achieve and why. You cannot feel the weight of those 6 ships sitting quietly in the dark, radar antennae turning, crews at battle stations, without knowing how many times the men who came before them had sat in similar darkness and come home broken or not come home at all. So tonight, that is what we are going to do. We are going to take the full measure of this battle. Not just the engagement itself, those brief, catastrophic minutes in the early hours of the 7th of August, but everything that preceded it and everything it set in motion. We are going to walk through the geography of the slot and understand why it was such a lethal operating environment. We are going to meet the Tokyo Express properly, not as a nickname or a curiosity, but as a genuine tactical system operated by skilled, experienced sailors who had earned every bit of the fear they inspired. We are going to sit with the failures, the institutional frustrations, the arguments about doctrine that played out in wardrooms and headquarters across the South Pacific while the campaign ground forward. And then we are going to follow Moosbrugger, a quiet man by most accounts, not the kind of commander who generated legends in his own time, but a commander who thought clearly, prepared thoroughly, trusted his crews, and on one particular night in 1943 executed a torpedo ambush so precisely, so completely, that it became a model the United States Navy studied for the rest of the war and beyond. There are roughly 1,000 men who went into the water that night with those 3 Japanese destroyers, sailors and soldiers both, because the destroyers had been carrying garrison troops along with their cargo of resupply drums. They are part of this story too. The Battle of Vella Gulf did not end when the last explosion faded. It continued in the dark water of the Gulf, in the efforts to rescue survivors, in the decisions that commanders on both sides made about those men in the hours that followed. War is not clean even when tactics are. This documentary will not pretend otherwise. What it will do is give you the complete picture, the strategy and the tactics, the technology and the human beings operating it, the institutional failures that made the victory necessary and the institutional learning that made it possible, the immediate aftermath and the longer strategic consequences, because what happened at Vella Gulf did not simply end a single resupply run, it began the unraveling of the Tokyo Express itself, and with it, the isolation of an entire Japanese garrison that Tokyo would eventually choose to abandon rather than reinforce. All of that, across the span of tonight. If you are new here, welcome. This channel exists for exactly these kinds of nights. Long-form, deeply researched, carefully told military history for the hours when the world goes quiet and you want to spend them somewhere worthwhile. Hit subscribe if you want to stay and settle in. Turn the brightness down a little if you need to. Get comfortable. You are not going anywhere for a while, and neither is this story. The slot is waiting, the radar screens are warming up, and somewhere in the darkness to the north, 4 Japanese destroyers are sailing south with absolute confidence. They do not know yet what is in the water ahead of them. There is a particular kind of darkness that belongs only to the South Pacific at night. It is not the clean darkness of open ocean, where a man on a bridge can at least read the horizon and find his bearings in the stars. It is something thicker, more deliberate, a darkness pressed down between islands whose black ridgelines dissolve into the sky, where squalls materialize without warning and a shoreline can appear at killing range before any lookout has the chance to call it out. In the summer of 1943, young American sailors aboard destroyer watches knew this darkness intimately. They had learned it the hard way, through losses that left the fleet shaken and the newspapers back home carefully vague. And somewhere in that darkness, running south on a schedule as reliable as a freight timetable, came the ships they had come to both fear and, however grudgingly, respect. By the middle of 1943, the Solomon Islands chain had become the central arena of the Pacific War's grinding attrition. The campaign had begun the previous August with the landings on Guadalcanal, a move that forced Japan onto the defensive and set the stage for a contest of will and logistics that neither side had fully anticipated. What followed was not the swift, decisive action either navy wanted. It was a slow, brutal, island-by-island struggle stretching northwest along the chain, each step contested at sea as fiercely as on land. American forces had secured Guadalcanal by February of 1943, but the fight had simply migrated up the archipelago. The island of New Georgia fell under assault through the summer, and beyond New Georgia, sitting astride the approach to the great Japanese base at Rabaul, lay Kolombangara, a roughly circular volcanic island whose garrison Japan had no intention of abandoning without a fight. Kolombangara presented the Imperial Japanese Navy with a problem that was equal parts military and logistical. The island's garrison needed food, ammunition, and men to replace those worn down by combat and disease. American air power made daylight resupply runs suicidal. The waters around Kolombangara were patrolled, bombed, and strafed from first light to last. But the night was different. The night belonged, for a long and painful stretch of that campaign, to Japan. And so the Japanese evolved a solution that was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. Fast destroyer runs down through the island-flanked corridor of New Georgia Sound, time to arrive, deliver, and return before the sun could expose them to air attack. It was a logistical system built entirely around darkness, speed, and the extraordinary capabilities of the men who operated it. American sailors and reporters gave this nightly procession a name that carried, in equal measure, sarcasm and genuine dread. They called it the Tokyo Express. The nickname conjured something almost mundane, a commuter service, a timetable, a predictable arrival and departure, and that ordinariness was part of what made it so humiliating. The Japanese were running a scheduled service down a sea lane that American forces nominally controlled, and for month after month through late 1942 and into 1943, the United States Navy could not stop it. The Express arrived, it delivered its cargo, it departed, and when American ships went out to intercept it, they came back damaged, diminished, or not at all. The operational rhythm of the Tokyo Express was built around the destroyer as a weapons system pushed to its absolute limit. Japanese destroyer captains ran their ships at speeds that would have alarmed a conservative commander close to 30 knots in confined, poorly charted waters, at night, with only lookouts and their own intimate knowledge of the sound to guide them. The resupply technique they developed was precise and coldly practical. Drums sealed with supplies were loaded onto the destroyer decks, strung together in long chains, and rolled into the water offshore of the garrison beach. Swimmers or small craft from the island would then drag the drums ashore, while the destroyers idled briefly before turning north and accelerating back up the slot towards safety. The whole evolution was designed to be completed within minutes, minimizing the time any ship spent stationary in hostile waters. It was not elegant in the way that set-piece naval battles are elegant. It was efficient in the way that survival is efficient. At the center of that efficiency was a Japanese destroyer force that had, by mid-1943, refined night surface combat into something approaching an art form. The crews were highly trained, highly motivated, and possessed of a tactical culture that valued aggression, precision, and the acceptance of risk in ways that their American counterparts were still learning to match. Japanese lookouts, trained rigorously in low-light visual spotting, could identify targets at ranges that repeatedly surprised American commanders who had assumed darkness would equalize the contest. Their torpedoes, the Type 93, a weapon running on liquid oxygen rather than the compressed air used by Allied equivalents, outranged anything the Americans carried, struck harder, and left no telltale bubble trail to betray its approach. It was a weapon purpose-built for the kind of night engagement the Japanese preferred, and they had used it with lethal effect on more than one occasion in these very waters. The losses the United States Navy had absorbed in the Solomons by the summer of 1943 were not minor setbacks. They formed a pattern of tactical defeat that was deeply troubling to anyone looking at the campaign honestly. The Battle of Savo Island in August of 1942 had cost the Allies 4 heavy cruisers in a single night, with the Japanese force withdrawing almost unscathed. The Battle of Tassafaronga in late 1942 had seen a Japanese destroyer force outnumbered and outgunned by American cruisers and destroyers, and yet the Japanese had still managed to sink 1 American cruiser and cripple 3 others while completing most of their resupply mission. The pattern was consistent and galling. American forces arrived with superior numbers and firepower, fell into confusion during the violent opening minutes of night engagement, and paid a price that bore no relationship to their material advantages. Each defeat left its mark on the fleet, not just in ships lost and men killed, but in the subtler damage done to a navy's confidence in its own doctrine and its own commanders. There was a question forming at the edges of every operational briefing in the South Pacific, a question that nobody stated outright, because stating it openly would have been damaging to morale. Were American sailors, in the darkness and the confined waters of the slot, simply outmatched? The Imperial Japanese Navy had been fighting this kind of war for years. Its doctrine was tuned for it. Its officers were trained for it. And its hardware, particularly that torpedo, was optimized for it. in ways that American naval planners were only beginning to fully understand. The Tokyo Express was not merely a logistical operation. It had become, through accumulated victories, a symbol of Japanese naval dominance in a body of water that sat at the center of the Pacific War's most contested front. And yet the story of the Solomons campaign in 1943 was also the story of an institution learning, painfully and at great cost, how to fight differently. The United States Navy in the South Pacific was not the same force it had been at Savo Island. It was studying its defeats with increasing analytical rigor, identifying the specific failures of doctrine and command that had produced them, and beginning to experiment with new approaches. Radar, the technology that had the potential to neutralize Japan's advantage in night visual spotting, was being integrated into tactical thinking in ways it had not been at Tassafaronga. Torpedo doctrine, hamstrung for years by faulty ordnance and conservative employment, was being re-examined. And within the destroyer community, a conversation was beginning about what these ships were actually capable of when freed from the role of cruiser escort and allowed to fight as independent strike forces. Kolombangara sat at the end of the Japanese supply chain like a statement of intent. As long as Japan could reinforce and resupply its garrison there, it retained a powerful blocking position across the American axis of advance toward Rabaul. The Tokyo Express was the mechanism by which that statement was maintained, night after night, through a sea that American losses had already turned into a graveyard. By the early days of August 1943, planning was underway for another interception attempt, another effort to cut the supply line, to stop the Express in its tracks. But this time, the thinking behind the attempt was different. The man selected to lead it was different. And the tactics he intended to use were different in ways that neither the Japanese nor, perhaps, the broader American naval establishment yet fully appreciated. The night of the 6th of August, 1943, was still days away. The destroyers of both nations were still in their harbors, their crews eating, sleeping, playing cards, and writing letters home to people who could not be told where they were or what they were about to sail into. On the American side, there was anxiety, the reasonable anxiety of sailors who knew the history of this water and carried it with them whenever they left port. On the Japanese side, there was confidence, the earned confidence of a force that had dominated this particular arena for nearly a year and had no strong reason to expect that the next night run would be any different from the last. Both sides were about to be surprised, but only one of them would be surprised in the way that changes the course of a campaign. The iron highway of the night was still open, the Express was still running, but in the darkness ahead, 6 American destroyers were preparing to close it forever. Look at a map of the Solomon Islands, and the geography tells its own story before a single ship has moved. The chain runs in a long diagonal slash from northwest to southeast, 2 roughly parallel rows of islands separated by a corridor of open water roughly 160 kilometers long, and at its narrowest points, barely 30 kilometers wide. The Americans who sailed it gave it a name that needed no elaboration. They called it the Slot. It was not a poetic name. It was a functional one, the kind of name men give to a place they have already learned to be afraid of. The islands on either side, Choiseul, Santa Isabel, New Georgia, Guadalcanal, rise steeply from the water, their volcanic flanks draped in equatorial jungle that runs all the way down to the shoreline. From the deck of a ship moving through the corridor at night, those dark masses loom close, closer than they appear on a chart, and the sense of confinement they create is not imagined, it is physical. The walls of the slot press in, and the water between them offers very little room to maneuver. The weather inside the slot did not cooperate with good visibility. The Solomon Islands sit just below the equator, and the tropical atmosphere generates squalls with almost no warning, dense curtains of rain that reduce visibility to almost nothing, followed by sudden breaks of clear air and hard tropical starlight. For a lookout on a destroyer's bridge in the summer of 1943, the conditions shifted constantly. One minute the sea ahead was visible for several kilometers, the next, a wall of white rain had swallowed the horizon entirely. Cloud cover over the islands was near permanent at night. blocking the moon that might otherwise have helped a navigator hold his position relative to the reef-studded coasts. Fog was rare, but the darkness that settled over the slot on an overcast night was the kind of darkness that has weight to it. Sailors described it in terms that sounded exaggerated to anyone who had never experienced it, and perfectly accurate to anyone who had. The geography created tactical problems that went beyond discomfort. The island coastlines that flanked the slot were not smooth, open shores. They were fractured and irregular, broken by capes, inlets, river mouths, and offshore reefs that scattered radar returns in ways that made the picture on an American radar scope extremely difficult to read. A contact that should have appeared as a clean return was instead buried in a smear of clutter from the land behind it. For American radar operators in the early part of the Solomons campaign, trying to distinguish a Japanese destroyer from the coastline return of New Georgia at close range required a kind of intuitive reading of the equipment that took months to develop. The Japanese understood this limitation well and used it deliberately, keeping their destroyer columns close to the island chains on the return leg after delivering supplies, using the landmass behind them as a natural screen against detection. It was sound tactical thinking, and for a long time it worked. The currents inside the corridor added another layer of hazard. The tidal flows between the islands were irregular and strong in places, and charts of the region in 1943 were not always reliable. The colonial-era survey data that formed the basis of American navigational charts had gaps, approximations, and outright errors that only revealed themselves when a ship got into trouble. Navigating at high speed in the slot at night meant accepting a baseline level of uncertainty about exactly where the bottom was. Destroyer captains who drove their ships hard through the corridor, which was often the only way to survive an engagement and return before dawn exposed them to air attack, were doing so with one eye on the radar, one eye on the chart, and the knowledge that the chart was not entirely trustworthy. And then there were the wrecks. By the middle of 1943, the floor of the slot and the waters around its southern entrance had become one of the most densely littered maritime graveyards in the world. The losses had begun accumulating almost from the moment American and Japanese forces first collided over Guadalcanal in the summer of 1942. The Battle of Savo Island, fought in the dark hours of the 9th of August, 1942, had set the tone with a ferocity that shocked the Allied command. 4 heavy cruisers, 3 American, 1 Australian, had been sunk in less than an hour by a Japanese cruiser force that moved through the darkness with a precision that seemed, to the surviving American sailors, almost supernatural. The waters off the northern coast of Guadalcanal, the patch of sea that would come to be known as Iron Bottom Sound, had begun to fill. It did not stop filling for the better part of a year. The engagements came in rapid succession through the autumn and winter of 1942 and into 1943, each adding its own tonnage to the bottom. The Battle of Cape Esperance in October of 1942 offered a brief American success, but it was followed within weeks by the naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November, a sprawling, disorganized series of night engagements that cost both sides heavily and produced some of the most brutal close-range fighting the Pacific War would see. American cruisers and destroyers went down in those November nights, and Japanese battleships and destroyers joined them on the bottom. The sea did not discriminate. It accepted whatever was sent into it. Then came Tassafaronga. On the 30th of November, 1942, an American force of 5 cruisers and 6 destroyers intercepted a Japanese destroyer resupply run at the western end of Guadalcanal. The Americans had radar. They had numerical superiority in guns. They had the advantage of surprise, opening fire first on a Japanese column that had not yet detected them. By any reasonable calculation, the engagement should have been a decisive American victory. It was not. The Japanese commander, working almost entirely on instinct and with extraordinary professional speed, launched a torpedo counterattack in the dark that struck 4 American cruisers. One of them sank. The others limped away damaged. The Japanese lost a single destroyer. Tassafaronga entered American naval memory as a lesson written in the most expensive possible ink. The captains and crews who received orders to take their destroyers into the slot in the months following these engagements were not unaware of this history. They had read the after-action reports, or heard accounts from men who had been there, or simply absorbed the knowledge through the particular professional osmosis that operates in a fleet at war. The names of the ships on the bottom were not abstractions. They were vessels with crews, crews with names, men whose gear was still stowed in lockers that were now sitting in several hundred meters of water. The wreck count by mid-1943 ran into dozens of major combatants from both sides, and the total loss in human life was a number that no one in the summer of 1943 had fully calculated, because the campaign was still ongoing and the accounting had not yet been closed. For an American destroyer sailor preparing for a run into the slot in August of 1943, the emotional weight of that history was specific and immediate. It was not the abstract awareness of a dangerous theatre that a pilot might feel looking at a map of heavily defended airspace. It was something more personal, the knowledge that the particular stretch of water his ship was about to enter had already swallowed ships whose crews had been as well trained, as alert, and as motivated as his own. The Japanese had beaten better prepared forces in these waters before. They had done it repeatedly. They had done it so consistently that a pattern had formed, and patterns, once established, are hard to think around. The slot also imposed a brutal operational logic on any mission conducted inside it. A force that entered from the south had to move quickly enough to engage, complete its work, and withdraw before daylight made it vulnerable to Japanese land-based air power operating from the airfields at Rabaul and the bases strung along the northern Solomons. The window for action was narrow. A destroyer force typically had only the hours of true darkness in which to find its target, fight, and run. There was no loitering, no cautious circling while headquarters deliberated. The geography of the slot enforced urgency whether commanders wanted it or not, an urgency in a narrow, wreck-strewn corridor at high speed in the dark carried its own category of risk entirely separate from enemy action. What the geography gave with one hand, it also, occasionally, took back. The same narrow channel that funneled American ships into a predictable path also funneled Japanese ships into one. The island walls that helped Japanese destroyers hide their radar signature also meant that a commander who had precise information about where his enemy was could predict, with reasonable confidence, where that enemy would be in 15 minutes and in 30. The slot was a killing ground in both directions. It had worked against the Americans for the better part of a year because the Japanese had been better at reading and using its conditions. The question hanging over every American interception attempt through the spring and early summer of 1943 was whether the balance could be shifted, whether a commander could be found who understood the corridor well enough not merely to survive it, but to use it. The answer to that question was being prepared in the form of 6 destroyers and one careful, methodical commander. But before any of that could matter, it was necessary to understand exactly what the Tokyo Express was, how it worked, and why it had been so brutally effective for so long. The slot had a rhythm, and Japan had learned to move inside it. To interrupt that rhythm, the Americans first had to understand it completely. The destroyers that ran the slot at night were not supply ships. They were warships doing a supply ship's job, and the distinction mattered enormously to the men who sailed them. Japan's Imperial Navy had built its destroyer force around a single, demanding philosophy: speed above almost everything else, and the willingness to close with the enemy at close range under cover of darkness. When the army garrison on Guadalcanal had begun hemorrhaging men faster than ordinary resupply could replace them, and when daylight movement through those waters had become a death sentence, courtesy of American air power, it was the destroyer commanders who stepped forward with a solution. The result was a logistics operation disguised as a combat patrol, and it would run with brutal efficiency for the better part of 2 years. The mechanics of the operation were elegant in their simplicity. Destroyers loaded their rear decks with sealed metal drums, each one packed with rice, medical supplies, ammunition, or whatever the garrison ashore needed most. The drums were roped together in long chains and stacked wherever deck space allowed without compromising the ship's combat capability. When the destroyer reached its destination, it did not anchor. Anchoring meant stillness, and stillness in those waters meant vulnerability. Instead, the drums were pushed over the side in a connected line. The shore party swam out or paddled out in small craft to collect the floating chain, and the destroyer was already accelerating away before the last drum hit the water. The entire offload could take minutes. The ship never stopped moving. What this method sacrificed in efficiency, it more than recovered in survivability. An anchored transport is a target. A destroyer running at 30 knots after dropping its cargo is a problem of a very different kind. The Japanese worked the timing of these runs with clockwork precision, departing their bases in the Upper Solomons in late afternoon, threading the slot through darkness, making their drop, and turning north again to be beyond practical range of American aircraft by dawn. The rhythm was so reliable that American intelligence officers could set their watches by it, and yet for a long stretch of the campaign, knowing when the express was coming proved far less useful than knowing how to stop it, a question that resisted easy answers. The men who commanded these runs were not ordinary sailors filling an administrative function. They were experienced, aggressive destroyer officers who had come up through a naval culture that prized night fighting as both an art and a discipline. Japanese destroyer training in the interwar years had placed enormous emphasis on torpedo work, in darkness, on crews maintaining their composure, their coordination, and their lethality under conditions that degraded the performance of almost every other navy in the world. By the time the Solomons campaign began, these crews had refined their techniques to the point where they could acquire, track, and engage targets at night with a fluency that repeatedly caught American commanders off guard. Their lookouts, trained with exceptional rigor and equipped with powerful optics, often detected American ships before American radar detected them, a fact that sounds almost impossible given the technological gap, but which the battle records confirm again and again. What made the Tokyo Express genuinely fearsome, however, was not the speed of the ships or the skill of the crews alone, it was the weapon those ships carried. The Type 93 torpedo, the weapon Allied sailors would eventually come to call the Long Lance, though that name came later, was in a different category from every other torpedo in the Pacific War. Where American torpedoes of the period ran on compressed air and left a white, betraying wake that gave a sharp-eyed lookout a few seconds of warning, the Type 93 ran on pure oxygen. Oxygen propulsion left almost no visible track in the water. It was, for practical purposes, invisible at night. The range of this weapon was staggering by the standards of the time. American destroyer torpedoes of the early war years were effective at perhaps 5 or 6 kilometers under operational conditions, and that figure was optimistic given the persistent reliability problems that plagued American torpedo programs. The Type 93 could reach out to roughly 40 kilometers at lower speeds, and could still strike at shorter ranges while running at speeds that gave a target almost no time to maneuver. At its combat settings, it carried a warhead large enough to break a cruiser's keel. Against destroyers, a single hit was typically fatal. The weapon had been developed through the 1920s and 30s in deliberate secrecy, and the Allies had no clear picture of its capabilities until they had already paid for that ignorance in wrecked ships and dead sailors. The first time many American officers truly reckoned with what this torpedo could do was in the waters off Guadalcanal, when Japanese destroyer formations appeared to engage at distances that American doctrine said were impossible for torpedo attack, and then American ships began to die. There was a persistent, disorienting quality to those early engagements. The sense that the enemy was operating by rules that had not been shared with you. After Tassafaronga, after the grinding series of night actions where Japanese destroyers repeatedly struck and withdrew before American formations could bring their numerical advantages to bear, the Long Lance was no longer a rumor. It was a fact written into American loss reports. The delivery of this weapon was as practiced as the resupply technique itself. Japanese destroyer divisions trained to maneuver as a coordinated body in darkness, communicating through light signals and pre-established procedures to minimize the radio transmissions that might betray their position. They approached their firing position at moderate speed to reduce their own bow, wave, and wake, launched their torpedoes in carefully calculated spreads, and then critically they did not wait to watch the results. They turned, accelerated, and put distance between themselves and whatever was about to happen. This aggressive exit philosophy saved Japanese destroyer divisions from retaliatory fire time and again, particularly in the early Solomon's actions where American gunnery, though accurate, arrived too late to engage ships already disappearing into the darkness. By the summer of 1943, the Tokyo Express had accumulated a record that any naval commander in history would have found remarkable. It had successfully resupplied isolated garrisons in the face of American air dominance. It had, in combat, destroyed or damaged American cruisers and destroyers in engagements where American forces had both numerical advantage and the knowledge that the Japanese were coming. It had done so while sustaining significant losses of its own, but losses that the Japanese, given their operational results, could frame as acceptable. The men who crewed those destroyers were not operating in ignorance of the danger. They understood perfectly well what American air power could do in daylight, and they had watched their own ships go down. They ran anyway, and they ran with precision, because that was what was asked of them. There is something in the operational record of the Tokyo Express that demands a particular kind of acknowledgement, not admiration for the cause it served, but recognition of the seamanship and tactical discipline it represented. These were men who had mastered a genuinely difficult problem: how to move fast, deliver, fight, and survive in a confined and hostile sea against an enemy that was learning, slowly but measurably, how to kill them. Their confidence by August of 1943 was not arrogance. It was the specific, earned confidence of a force that had tested its methods and found them sufficient. The question that the summer of 1943 was building toward was whether those methods would remain sufficient against an American destroyer force that had spent the preceding months doing something the Japanese had not. Fully anticipated, studying its own failures with clear eyes, changing its doctrine at every level, from torpedo tactics to command authority, and preparing for a night when the terms of engagement in the slot would be very different from anything the Express had encountered before. The drums would still be roped together on the rear decks. The lookouts would still be scanning the dark water with their powerful optics. The torpedo crews would still be ready at their stations, trained and confident in a weapon that had earned its reputation through repeated, devastating proof. What the Tokyo Express commanders pressing south on the night of the 6th of August, 1943, could not see and could not yet know was that somewhere in the darkness ahead of them, 6 American destroyers were already watching. They had been watching for some time, and they had learned to be very, very patient. There is a particular kind of defeat that does more damage than the physical, the kind that burrows into an institution and makes it doubt itself. By the autumn of 1942, the United States Navy in the South Pacific had begun to accumulate exactly that kind of wound. Ship for ship, sailor for sailor, the American destroyer force was not inferior to the Japanese. The men were willing, the steel was sound, the guns were capable, and yet, night after night in the narrow waters above Guadalcanal, American formations sailed out with numerical advantages and returned with fewer ships than they had left with. The pattern was consistent enough to have a name, and the name was the slot. What the Navy was learning there, slowly and at terrible cost, was that numbers alone do not win battles in the dark. Doctrine wins battles in the dark. And American doctrine, in those months, was badly broken. The disaster at Tassafaronga in the last days of November 1942 stands as perhaps the sharpest lesson of that entire painful education. An American force of cruisers and destroyers, a force that substantially outnumbered the Japanese column it was hunting, made radar contact with a Tokyo Express resupply run and pressed in to engage. The contact was good. The radar picture was clear. The Americans had every technological reason for confidence. Yet, within minutes of the opening of the engagement, Japanese torpedoes were running through the dark water toward ships whose captains had not yet registered the threat. 4 American cruisers were hit. One of them went to the bottom, The others were torn open and put out of action for months. The Japanese lost a single destroyer. It was not a close contest. It was a lesson delivered in steel and fire to a navy that believed its radar gave it an invincibility it had not yet earned. What went wrong at Tassafaronga was not courage, it was process. The American destroyers that night were never properly released to act as an independent torpedo strike force. They were kept leashed to the cruisers, subordinated to a battle plan that treated them as screening elements rather than attack weapons. The result was that when the order to fire finally came, it came late, and it came without the geometric precision that a well-executed torpedo spread requires. The torpedoes that were launched mostly missed. Meanwhile, the Japanese destroyers, caught in the light of American gunfire but crewed by men who had rehearsed exactly this scenario, swung their bows, fired their long lances, and drove their weapons across a distance that American planners had not even considered dangerous. The geometry of the engagement was wrong from the first minute, and no amount of fighting spirit could correct it once the weapons were in the water. What compounded the tactical failure was something deeper, something embedded in the Navy's culture at the time. There was a hierarchy of prestige in the surface fleet, and destroyers sat near the bottom of it. Battleships were the measure of naval power. Cruisers carried the institutional weight. Destroyers were escorts, screens, utility vessels, instruments of protection rather than of strike. This thinking shaped how destroyer captains were trained, how they were expected to behave in formation, and critically, how they were expected to subordinate their judgment to the senior officer present. The impulse to wait for orders, to hold fire until directed, to maintain formation discipline at the cost of tactical initiative, these were not failures of nerve. They were the products of a training system that had not yet imagined a world where the destroyer was the decisive weapon of a night engagement. Changing that thinking would require more than new orders. It would require new beliefs. The torpedo problem made everything worse. Through much of 1942, American destroyer torpedoes were failing with a regularity that bordered on the inexplicable. Crews who had done everything right approach, targeting, firing solution watched their weapons run true and then simply fail to detonate. The Mark 15 torpedo that American destroyers carried had defects that took an embarrassingly long time to identify and correct, in part because institutional pride resisted the obvious conclusion that the weapons were faulty. When a torpedo missed, it was easier to attribute the failure to the crew than to the weapon. But the failures were accumulating in a way that could not be explained away, and every missed opportunity in the slot was compounding the psychological cost. Crews began to lose faith in their primary weapon at the precise moment when they needed to believe in it most. Beyond equipment and doctrine, there was the question of command. Not every officer sent to operate in the Solomons had the mental agility the environment demanded. The waters were confined. The nights were dark and unpredictable. The Japanese were operating with a speed and aggression that rewarded boldness and punished hesitation. Some American commanders, faced with radar contacts and incomplete intelligence, chose the conservative option, and in the slot, conservative options had a way of becoming catastrophic ones. Caution that was entirely rational in open ocean warfare became a liability in the narrow corridors between islands, where the geometry of an engagement could shift in seconds, and where a commander who paused to seek confirmation often found that the moment for action had already passed. The South Pacific was burning through senior officers, and the ones who remained were learning or they were being replaced. Admiral William Halsey, commanding the South Pacific Theater, was not a patient man in the ordinary sense, but he understood that the impatience he felt had to be applied carefully. Replacing commanders wholesale was not the answer, and he knew it. What was needed was a change in how the Navy's destroyer officers thought about their role, a change that would have to come from within the destroyer community itself, modeled by men who had actually worked out the right approach and could demonstrate it. Halsey needed a victory, not just for the strategic pressure it would relieve, but for what it would prove: that American destroyer forces could fight and win in the slot on their own terms, without numerical advantage, without cruiser support, and against an enemy who had, for more than a year, treated night fighting in those waters as something close to a private preserve. The pressure was institutional as well as operational. By the middle of 1943, the broader course of the Pacific War was beginning to shift on other fronts, but the Solomons remained a grinding, costly campaign where American forces had not yet demonstrated the kind of decisive surface action that would force the Japanese to reconsider their options. The Tokyo Express continued to run, Kolombangara remained supplied, and in Washington, the question of why the most powerful navy in the world could not seem to win a straightforward night destroyer engagement was one that no one in the South Pacific Command wanted to be asked. The need for a clean, unambiguous victory won by doctrine, not by luck, was becoming acute. Into this climate of institutional pressure and hard-learned uncertainty, certain officers within the destroyer community had been doing something quiet and important. They had been thinking. They had been reading the after-action reports from Tassafaronga and the earlier engagements, identifying the specific moments where decisions had gone wrong and working out what a different approach might look like. The conclusions were not radical in retrospect, but they required a kind of confidence in the destroyer's independent offensive capability that the existing culture had not yet fully endorsed. The torpedo attack had to come first, before gunfire. The destroyers had to be free to maneuver independently. The radar picture had to be trusted and acted upon quickly, before the enemy could react. And the torpedo-firing solution had to be allowed to mature, which meant holding fire through some of the most nerve-testing minutes a crew could experience, while the enemy closed without knowing he was already in someone's crosshairs. What the Navy needed, in other words, was not better ships, or more of them. It needed an officer who had already reached these conclusions, who had the tactical clarity to execute them under pressure, and who had the command authority and the personal credibility to make the crews around him believe they would work. The painful education of the previous year had produced exactly the conditions in which such an officer could be found useful. Every defeat had been a data point. Every lost ship had, in the brutal arithmetic of institutional learning, brought a small increment of understanding. The question was whether the understanding would be applied in time and by the right hands, before the Japanese consolidated an advantage that would become permanent in those waters. The summer of 1943 brought with it a gathering sense that something was about to change. The losses had accumulated long enough that the lesson was finally legible across the whole of the institution. New doctrine was circulating, new officers were being elevated. The torpedo problems were, piece by piece, being identified and addressed. And in the destroyer squadrons operating out of bases in the South Pacific, there were captains who had absorbed everything the previous year had offered, and were ready, truly ready to do something entirely different with it. The darkness over the slot had not changed. The geography was the same narrow corridor of water, island-flanked and treacherous, but the men preparing to sail into it were different men now, shaped by defeat into something harder and more precise. All they needed was the right night, the right orders, and the right commander to put it all together. There is a particular kind of officer the United States Navy produces only occasionally, not the loudest voice in the room, not the one whose ambition announces itself the moment he enters, but the one whose subordinates trust without quite being able to explain why. Frederick Moosbrugger was that kind of officer. He had come up through the destroyer community at a time when destroyers were not considered the glamorous assignment, when the carriers and the battleships commanded the headlines and the promotion boards, and when a man who chose the small ships was understood to have made a certain quiet statement about what he valued. Moosbrugger had made that statement willingly. He understood destroyers not as supporting players in someone else's battle plan, but as weapons in their own right, fast, lethal, and badly misused by a navy that had spent years treating them like mounted cavalry attached to an infantry column. That understanding would matter enormously in the summer of 1943, when the South Pacific Force needed a commander who would take 6 destroyers into the slot and do something that had not yet been done cleanly: win. His background was not the stuff of popular legend. There were no celebrated single-handed exploits in his record, no dramatic moments that had already made the press by the time his name came to Admiral Theodore Wilkinson's attention. What his record showed instead was a sustained pattern of professional seriousness, careful study of tactics, rigorous attention to the machinery and training of the ships he commanded, and a reputation among fellow destroyer officers as someone who had genuinely thought about the problem. That last quality was rarer than it should have been. The Navy had fought 4 major surface engagements in the slot by the middle of 1943 and had come away from all of them with hard lessons that had not yet been fully absorbed at every level of command. Moosbrugger had absorbed them. He had watched what happened at Tassafaronga, studied the action reports, and arrived at conclusions that challenged the way American destroyers had been habitually employed. A man who had done that kind of thinking was exactly what the moment required. Wilkinson's selection of Moosbrugger was not a gamble, it was a deliberate choice based on the kind of informal professional network that has always existed within naval communities. Officers talk about other officers. They form assessments, pass them along, update them with each new piece of evidence. The picture that had assembled around Moosbrugger in those conversations was consistent. Here was a destroyer man who understood what his ships could do, who kept his crews at a level of readiness that was above average, and who did not freeze or hedge when situations moved faster than plans allowed. In the South Pacific in the summer of 1943, that combination was as important as any formal credential. Wilkinson needed someone who would not second-guess a torpedo solution at the critical moment, who would not default to caution when aggression was the correct answer, and who would not let the accumulated weight of previous defeats make his crews timid. Moosbrugger was that man. The core of his tactical thinking could be stated simply, though executing it was anything but simple. American destroyers, in Moosbrugger's view, had been consistently wasted as gun platforms and radar pickets attached to cruiser formations, forced to conform to the speed and maneuver of larger ships when they should have been operating as an independent strike force built around their torpedo batteries. The torpedo was the destroyer's primary weapon, a long-range, high-speed instrument of destruction that could engage a target before the enemy knew an attack was coming. Using destroyers primarily as gunships, or keeping them in formation with cruisers whose own maneuver requirements dominated the battle plan, threw away the destroyer's greatest advantage: the ability to attack silently from an unexpected angle before the enemy could respond. Tassafaronga had demonstrated what Japanese torpedoes could do when fired at close range against an American formation that had already revealed itself through gunfire. Moosbrugger intended to reverse that equation entirely. What made his tactical vision distinctive was not any single idea but the discipline required to hold the idea together under pressure. The plan required that his 1st Division approach the target unseen, achieve a favorable firing angle using radar rather than visual contact, release a full spread of torpedoes, and then go dark, no guns, no transmissions, nothing that would alert the Japanese column until the weapons had already arrived. The 2nd Division would be positioned separately, ready to engage with gunfire once the torpedo detonations had broken the enemy formation, and the moment for gun action had come on American terms rather than Japanese ones. This required the 2 divisions to operate as a single coordinated instrument without constant communication, trusting the plan, trusting the radar picture, and trusting each other. It required every commanding officer in both divisions to understand not just what they were supposed to do, but why, so that when conditions shifted, as they always did, they could adapt without losing the essential logic of the attack. Moosbrugger spent the days before the operation in briefings that were less about issuing orders and more about building shared understanding. Officers who were present in those sessions later recalled a commander who explained his reasoning fully, who invited questions that challenged his assumptions, and who made it plain that he expected his captains to think rather than merely comply. This was not universal in the Navy of 1943, where the hierarchies of rank and the cultures of certain commands could discourage junior officers from voicing doubts or proposing alternatives. Moosbrugger actively worked against that tendency. He knew that a plan which only made sense to its author was a brittle thing, that the first confusion of a night engagement could shatter it. A plan that 6 commanding officers genuinely understood and believed in was something different. It could flex without breaking. The 6 ships he commanded were not a unit that had trained together for months. They had come together with the compressed timeline that the Pacific War routinely imposed, with crews that ranged from seasoned veterans who had already passed through earlier slot battles to younger sailors, for whom this would be their first real engagement. Moosbrugger was attentive to that mixture. He did not pretend the anxiety was not there. The men knew the history of the slot as well as he did, knew the ships already rusting on its floor, knew the reputation of the Tokyo Express and the weapon system that had built it. What he could offer them was not a promise that nothing would go wrong, but something more credible, a plan that gave them a genuine advantage if they executed it with discipline, and a commander who had thought through that plan carefully enough to believe in it himself. That quality of genuine belief is not a small thing aboard a warship. Crews are not naive about the emotional register of their officers. They can hear the difference between a commander who is suppressing his own doubt and one who has worked through to something like conviction. Moosbrugger projected the latter. The men who served under him in those days before the battle described a calm that was not indifference. He was clearly engaged, clearly focused, but that carried no visible edge of anxiety. He moved through the preparations with the deliberate quality of someone who has done the mental work and is now simply doing the physical work that follows from it. That quality moved through the ships with him in the way that certain things do when they come from the top. His insistence on the independent torpedo strike as the centerpiece of the operation also reflected a deeper understanding of what had gone wrong in the earlier slot battles. In several of those engagements, American destroyers had been ordered to fire star shells or use their guns in ways that illuminated their own positions and gave Japanese torpedo crews exactly the targeting solution they needed. The long lance, as American sailors had come to know it, did not require radar guidance. It required only a bearing and a visible aiming point, and a column of American ships lit up by its own guns provided both. Moosbrugger's plan removed that opportunity. His first division would be invisible until the torpedoes detonated. The Japanese column would have no warning, no aiming point, no time. That was the design, and it was a design built from the specific, painful lessons of what had come before. There was also a geographic dimension to his thinking that reflected careful study of the operational area. The slot was not a body of water where a commander could simply close his eyes and charge. Its coastlines and island masses created radar anomalies that could obscure contacts or produce false ones. Its currents and squall lines could disrupt formation keeping, and its confined width meant that a column of ships making a torpedo run had limited room to maneuver if things went wrong. Moosbrugger had factored all of that into his approach angles, his planned positions, the separation between his two divisions. The geometry of the attack was not improvised, it was worked out against the actual chart of Vella Gulf, with the island of Kolombangara as one boundary and the La Vella coast as another, and the expected Japanese track running through the middle. He knew where he wanted his ships to be and why, and his officers knew it too. By the evening of the 6th of August, 1943, the preparations were as complete as they could be. The plans had been briefed, the radar operators had been reminded of what to look for and when to report it, the torpedo crews knew their firing sequences, and the captains of both divisions understood the moment at which they would shift from the maneuvering phase of the operation to the attack phase. What remained was the transit into the slot itself, the hours of waiting in the dark while the radar picture built and the Japanese column, unknowing, closed the distance. On every bridge, in every fire control station, in every torpedo mount, there were men who had been shaped by the accumulated weight of what the Navy had lost in these waters, carrying that weight into the night alongside the man who had been given the task of changing the outcome. Moosbrugger had given them the best possible set of tools for doing that. What happened next would depend on whether the tools, the training, and the plan held together in the minutes that could not be rehearsed, the minutes when the geometry of the ambush became real, and 6 ships became weapons. When Frederick Moosbrugger received his orders, he did not have a fleet. He had 6 destroyers. 6 ships, assembled from the scattered commitments of a navy still fighting on multiple axes across thousands of kilometers of ocean, and he had a narrow window of time in which to turn them into something that could do what American forces had repeatedly failed to do in the slot. The number was not generous. It was not overwhelming. But Moosbrugger understood, in a way that not every commander before him had, that 6 destroyers used correctly were not a compromise, they were an instrument. The question was whether he could make his crews understand that too, and whether he could make them believe it before the night came. The 6 ships were divided into 2 sections, each with a distinct and deliberate purpose. Moosbrugger's own division, the first 3 destroyers, would form the strike element. Their job was singular and unambiguous: close the Japanese column from a concealed angle, fire every torpedo they carried, and then pull away before the enemy could respond. They would not open with guns. They would not announce themselves with muzzle flash or tracer. They would speak first in the language of unseen weapons running silent through black water, and they would do it with enough volume that the mathematics of destruction would be difficult to escape. The second division, under its own commander, held a supporting role standing off at a distance, ready to engage with gunfire once the torpedoes had struck, to finish what the first division started, and to cut off any attempt at flight. The beauty of the arrangement, if something this ruthlessly functional could be called beautiful, was its clarity. Every ship knew its role, every captain knew his moment. There was no ambiguity to create hesitation. The planning sessions were conducted with an intensity that the men who attended them would remember long afterward. Moosbrugger was not a man who delivered orders as performance. He worked through the problem in front of his officers, walking them along the geometry of the engagement, the angle of approach, the preferred firing position, the distance at which the torpedo solution would be cleanest, the timing required to keep the second division from crossing into the path of the first division's weapons. He had studied the mistakes that had been made before him, and he was not shy about naming them. At Tassafaronga, American ships had led with guns, lighting up the engagement before their torpedoes had a chance to work, and the Japanese had responded with a long-lance salvo that took ships apart before the advantage could be pressed. That sequence, that fatal inversion of priorities, would not repeat itself on his watch. The torpedo attack would come first, the guns would follow. That was not a preference, it was the plan. The tactical briefings filtered down through the chain of command with the care of men who knew that understanding could not stop at the wardroom door. Division officers carried the plan to their department heads. Department heads carried it to their petty officers. By the time Moosbrugger's formation slipped its moorings and moved toward the canal of darkness that was the slot, the sailors at the torpedo tubes and the men at the gun mounts and the radar operators pressed over their scopes had all been told, in language as plain as their officers could manage, what was expected of them and why. This was not standard procedure. Plenty of operations had gone into combat with the ordinary men knowing only their individual station and nothing of the larger design. Moosbrugger wanted something different. He wanted crews who understood the logic of what they were doing, because men who understand the purpose of a plan are more likely to hold it together when the plan begins to strain against contact with the enemy. The crews themselves were a composite of experience and inexperience that reflected the Navy's broader condition in the summer of 1943. There were petty officers who had been in destroyers since before the war, men who had learned their trade in peacetime and then had it violently revised by the opening years of a conflict that bore no resemblance to any exercise. They had seen what happened when things went wrong in the slot. Some of them had survived engagements that had left other ships on the bottom, and they carried that knowledge in the particular, compressed way that survivors carry things, close and heavy and not often spoken about. Then there were the younger men, newer to their ships and newer to their ratings, who brought energy and a kind of fearlessness that came partly from inexperience and partly from the genuine adaptability of youth. Moosbrugger needed both types. The veterans kept the green sailors from unraveling in the dark. The green sailors kept the veterans from becoming too careful. Anxiety, in a formation preparing for a night engagement in the slot in 1943, was not a weakness. It was the appropriate response to the information available. The men of Moosbrugger's command knew the record. They knew that American destroyers had engaged Japanese forces in these same waters, with similar intelligence, with similar intentions, and had come off badly enough to make the names of those battles words that nobody wanted to repeat. Tassafaronga, Savo Island, Vella Gulf. These were not distant cautionary tales, they were recent history, some of them barely months old, and some of the men now checking their equipment and running their pre-engagement routines had personal connections to sailors lost in those actions. The question of whether this time would be different was real, and it did not have a comfortable answer available in advance. What Moosbrugger offered instead of comfort was a plan built specifically against the pattern of those failures and the suggestion, backed by his own calm authority, that the pattern could be broken. The physical preparation of the ships ran parallel to the mental preparation of the men. Torpedo crews verified their weapons and their settings. Fire control teams ran through their solutions. Radar operators calibrated their sets against the particular demands of the coastline they would be working along, the same radar-confusing terrain that had previously made night navigation in the slot a matter of educated guesswork. Moosbrugger and his captains knew that the radar picture would be complicated by the island masses on both sides of the corridor, and they planned accordingly, establishing reference points, agreeing on the moment at which a radar contact could be confirmed as the Japanese column rather than a landmass echo, and determining the exact range at which the 1st Division would begin its firing run. These were the decisions that would need to hold under pressure, in darkness, when everything was happening faster than any briefing could fully prepare a man for. One of the structural advantages Moosbrugger's plan carried was the physical separation between his two divisions. By keeping the 2nd Division far enough offset to avoid the torpedo danger zone, he was solving a problem that had plagued previous multi-ship engagements in confined waters, the tendency for ships to interfere with each other's weapons or crowd into each other's firing arcs at the worst possible moment. The two-division arrangement forced a spatial discipline on the formation that the geometry of the slot made difficult to maintain, but Moosbrugger had calculated his margins carefully. He knew the waters. He knew his captains. He trusted the plan to survive first contact if every ship held its position and every commander executed his role in sequence, rather than improvising in response to the unpredictable. The hours before departure carried the particular atmosphere that anyone who is prepared for something dangerous and irreversible will recognize a kind of sharpened ordinariness, where men eat and check their gear and speak to each other with slight excess of care, because the mundane acts of preparation are easier to perform than the act of waiting. Letters had been written by some, or not written by others, who chose instead the private economy of not beginning something they might not finish. Machinery was checked that had already been checked. The things sailors do before an engagement were done, and then the ships moved out, in formation, into the darkness of the surrounding sea. There was a final quality to Moosbrugger's plan that distinguished it from the tactical approaches his predecessors had brought to similar missions, and it was perhaps the hardest quality to convey in a briefing, but the most important to maintain once the engagement began. It was patience. The plan required the 1st Division to close the Japanese column, acquire a clean firing solution, and hold until that solution was good enough, not merely adequate, but genuinely precise before pressing the firing trigger. In previous engagements, the pressure of the moment, the fear of being detected first, the instinct to act before the enemy could act, had led American commanders to fire too early or to open with guns before the torpedoes had done their work. Moosbrugger's insistence was the opposite, that the advantage belonged to the side that held its nerve longest and fired when the mathematics were in its favor, rather than when the anxiety became unbearable. It was a doctrine of controlled aggression. Strike from concealment, strike with maximum weight, strike at the moment of best advantage, and trust the plan enough to wait for that moment even when waiting felt like exposure. 6 ships, 2 divisions. One plan built from the wreckage of everything that had gone before it. In the final hours before the formation entered the slot, what Moosbrugger had assembled was not merely a tactical formation, but an argument, a deliberate, carefully constructed argument against the pattern of American failure in these waters, made in steel and torpedoes and disciplined restraint. Whether that argument would hold, whether the hours of planning would survive contact with a Japanese column that had its own speed and its own weapons and its own long confidence in this corridor of dark water, would only be answered once the radar screens showed what the night was hiding. On the evening of the 6th of August, 1943, 4 Japanese destroyers put to sea from their anchorage and turned their bows southward. They were lean, fast ships, built for exactly this kind of work, high-speed runs down the length of New Georgia Sound under cover of darkness, delivering what the garrison at Kolombangara needed to survive, and returning home before American aircraft could find them in the dawn light. To the men aboard those ships, this was not a desperate gamble. It was a routine. It was something they had done before, and before that, and before that again. The Tokyo Express had made this run so many times, against so many American attempts to stop it, that the mission carried with it a particular quality that is perhaps the most dangerous thing a fighting force can possess. It carried the weight of expectation, the expectation that it would work, the expectation that tonight would be like all the other nights. That confidence was not irrational. It had been built carefully, engagement by engagement, across months of brutal night combat in the slot. Japanese destroyer crews were among the most rigorously trained sailors in any navy in the world at that point in the war. Their night fighting doctrine had been honed through years of peacetime exercises conducted specifically in low-light conditions, drills that the United States Navy had never matched in either intensity or frequency. Their lookouts were trained to extraordinary levels of visual acuity, using binoculars optimized for night observation, scanning assigned sectors with a patience and discipline that bordered on the clinical. Time and again, those lookouts had seen American ships before American ships had seen them. Time and again, that fractional advantage had decided the outcome before the first torpedo left its tube. The men on those bridges had earned their confidence the hard way, and they knew it. The commander responsible for that night's run carried the operational record of the Tokyo Express on his shoulders in the most immediate sense. He had been given 4 destroyers for the mission, a modest but well-practiced force by the standards of these nightly runs. 3 of the 4 ships were loaded with the drums that gave the resupply method its practical genius and its tactical limitation in the same breath. The drums, packed with rice, medical supplies and ammunition, were lashed to the upper decks and to lines rigged for quick release over the side. Once in the delivery zone, the ships would not anchor, would not slow to a crawl. They would make a sweeping pass, cut the lines, and let the current and the pre-positioned shore parties do the rest. Speed was everything. Vulnerability was the price of that speed, and on this night, no one on those bridges believed the price would come due. What those drums represented, however, was more than just logistics. They represented constraint. A destroyer loaded with supply drums is not the same weapons platform as a destroyer cleared for action. Certain torpedo tube arcs were partially obstructed. Deck crews whose battle stations might otherwise place them at guns or torpedo mounts were instead assigned to drum release details. The rhythm of a resupply run and the rhythm of a night surface engagement are different rhythms, and the human mind and the ship's company cannot always shift cleanly from one to the other in the span of seconds. The Japanese commanders knew this trade-off. They had always known it. But the calculus had consistently resolved in their favor across the preceding months, and there was no particular reason on the evening of the 6th of August to believe that the calculus had changed. The formation they adopted for the transit was a column single file, ships following ships in a line stretching back through the dark water. This was standard practice for the Tokyo Express. A column is efficient. It presents a narrow silhouette to anyone watching from the flanks, it simplifies station keeping in confined waters, and it allows the lead ship to act as a pathfinder, its wake giving those behind a visible track to follow. In the tight, island-crowded waters of the slot, where coastlines crowded in on both sides and the margin for navigational error was unforgiving, a column made practical sense. Japanese navigators had run this particular stretch of water enough times to know its rhythms, its shoals, its quirks. The column was a tool that had served them well. It was also, on this particular night, the geometry of catastrophe, though no one aboard those ships could know it yet. Their approach to the question of detection rested almost entirely on their lookouts and on their understanding of American limitations. Japanese naval thinking in this period placed visual detection by trained human observers above radar as the primary means of finding the enemy at night. This was not simply conservatism, it was a doctrine rooted in demonstrated results. Their lookouts had outperformed American radar on multiple occasions in the preceding year, identifying American ships and cueing torpedo attacks before American commanders even realized contact had been made. American radar in the earlier engagements had frequently produced confused pictures, false returns from the island-cluttered coastlines, ranges and bearings that were difficult to interpret quickly under pressure. The Japanese had watched those limitations play out to lethal effect for American forces, and they had drawn the logical conclusion. Their eyes in the dark were better than American machines. The record supported that conclusion. What the record could not account for was the degree to which American radar technology and, crucially, American radar operators had improved in the intervening months. There was also the matter of what the Japanese column did not know was waiting for them. Intelligence about American naval deployments in the Central Solomons was imperfect on both sides, but on this night, the asymmetry was particularly pronounced. Moose Brugger's 6 destroyers had been positioned and were operating under strict radio silence. They were not broadcasting. They were not illuminating with radar in any pattern that would carry down the length of the slot and announce their presence. They were, in the language of every hunting tradition, downwind and still. The Japanese formation was moving through water it believed it owned, watched by nothing except the dark hills of the islands sliding past on either side, and the stars above, and the quiet confidence of men who had made this run before. The 4 destroyers pressed southward at a speed suited to the delivery timetable. They were not racing. There was no particular urgency that the commanders felt in those hours. The garrison at Columbanga needed what was in those drums, and the mission was to get it there and get home, and the mission had always worked. There may have been, among the junior officers and enlisted men on those ships, the particular tiredness that comes from repeated operational tempo the Solomons campaign had been grinding on for a year, and these runs were not without their physical toll, but the institutional mood was one of competence. These ships and these crews had been tested and had not broken. That is a powerful thing to feel, standing on the bridge of a warship on a dark night, running through familiar water. What the Japanese column could not see, and could not have seen with any tool at its disposal, was the radar picture forming on the screens of Moose Brugger's destroyers to the south. Radar pulses do not announce themselves to the target. There is no whistle, no shimmer on the horizon, no change in the sound of the sea. A ship tracked by radar does not feel tracked. It moves through the water as it always has, its wake spreading out behind it, its bow parting the same dark ocean it has always parted. On the bridges of those 4 Japanese destroyers, the sea was as it always was. The lookouts swept their sectors, the navigators marked their position, the drum release crews stood by their lines. The night was doing what the slot nights always did, concealing, compressing, turning every sound into ambiguity and every shadow into nothing more alarming than a shadow. And yet somewhere ahead of them, invisible, patient, positioned at angles that the column's narrow forward silhouette made almost impossible to detect even if lookouts had been scanning in precisely the right direction at precisely the right moment, 6 American destroyers were watching. Not with eyes, with pulses of electromagnetic energy bouncing off steel hulls and returning home with the precise, cold certainty of physics. The radar operators sitting at their scopes in those darkened combat information centers could see the Japanese column clearly, its course, its speed, its spacing, its absolute unawareness of what was ahead. The picture was sharp. It was updating. It was accurate, and it was being fed, in disciplined quiet, to the men who would decide when to act. The Japanese commanders on that night were good at their trade. Let that be said plainly. They were skilled sailors operating a proven system in waters they knew, employing tactics that had cost the United States Navy enormously across the previous 12 months. Their confidence was the confidence of demonstrated professional competence, not arrogance born from nothing. But competence is not static. The competition that shapes it does not pause. And the Americans waiting in the darkness to the south were no longer the same Americans who had been mauled at Tassafaronga and humiliated at Savo Island. They had been schooled by those defeats. They had changed their thinking, their doctrine, their habits. They had, above all, learned to trust a technology that their enemy did not fully reckon with. On the 6th of August, 1943, The Japanese column was sailing south on the strength of everything it knew. It did not yet know what it did not know. That gap, invisible and absolute, was the decisive terrain of the entire engagement. The drums were ready, the crews were at their stations, the ships were making their speed, carving their wakes through the black water of the slot. And somewhere in the darkness ahead, the geometry of the night was already arranged against them. Below the waterline of New Georgia Sound, the bottom was already thick with the dead. Above it, the night of the 6th of August, 1943, had settled into the particular darkness of the Solomons, not a clean darkness, but a layered one, pressed down by overcast sky and broken only at the margins by the faint phosphorescence that salt water conjures when a hull moves through it. 6 American destroyers were threading that darkness, running without lights, without unnecessary radio transmissions, without the kinds of small human sounds that travel across still water with unnerving fidelity. They were running on electricity and nerve, and in the belly of each ship, behind steel doors and blackout curtains, young men were watching green lights sweep across circular screens and seeing, in those slow revolutions, something the night itself could not show them. The radar sets aboard Moosbrugger's destroyers were the beating heart of the entire operation. American surface search radar technology had matured substantially through the brutal schooling of the preceding year. And by the summer of 1943, the sets fitted to destroyer flotillas in the South Pacific were capable of painting a reasonably reliable picture of surface contacts at ranges that would have seemed fantastical to the officers who had stumbled through the night actions off Savo Island and Tassafaronga almost entirely blind. The operators who worked those sets were not glamorous figures in the wartime popular imagination that space was occupied by fighter pilots and submariners, but on this particular night in Vella Gulf, they were the most consequential men in the entire formation. Every command decision Moosbrugger would make in the hours ahead would flow from what those operators saw, interpreted, and reported up the chain. Radar operation in combat conditions was not the clean, mechanical process that peacetime training suggested it might be. The screens produced returns that required interpretation, coastlines cluttered the edge of the picture, rain squalls threw up confusing masses of noise, and the distinction between a destroyer-sized contact and a rain cell moving at speed demanded the kind of experienced eye that only hours of operational use could develop. The men at those sets on the night of the 6th of August had been carefully selected. They had learned their trade in waters that punished error, and in the weeks leading up to this mission, Moosbrugger had made clear through his staff that the radar picture would be the foundation upon which everything else was built. He was not a commander who treated radar as a secondary confirmation tool. He treated it as primary intelligence, feeding directly into tactical decision-making, and he expected his operators to function accordingly. In the earliest hours of contact, long before any gun was trained or any torpedo tube rotated toward a bearing, the story of the Battle of Vella Gulf was being written in light on green glass. The Japanese column 4 destroyers pushing south through the slot, in the confident formation that had served the Tokyo Express through so many successful runs, first appeared as faint returns at a range that gave Moosbrugger's force what every ambush requires above everything else: time. Time to confirm, time to maneuver, time to place every ship exactly where the geometry of destruction demanded it be placed before the enemy had any reason to suspect that anyone was watching. The radar operators reported their contacts with quiet precision, using the compressed, functional language of men who understood that clarity in a darkened radar room could be the difference between a controlled attack and a catastrophe. The information flow from radar room to bridge was a chain that could not afford a single weak link. Reports moved upward through the ship's internal communication system, carrying bearing, estimated range, and where possible, a count of individual contacts within the return. On Moosbrugger's flagship, those reports accumulated into a developing tactical picture that his staff and he were continuously updating, comparing against the chart, and translating into course and speed adjustments for the formation. Other ships in the column received coordinated information through brief, carefully worded tactical transmissions, the minimum necessary, sent at the minimum necessary moments, because every unnecessary radio emission was a signature the Japanese could potentially detect, and the entire premise of the American plan depended on remaining invisible for as long as possible. Radio silence was not merely a standing order. On that night, it was discipline enforced by collective understanding. The sailors knew what silence was worth. The contrast between the two forces pressing toward each other through Vella Gulf in those hours was one of the defining asymmetries of the engagement. On the Japanese side, the destroyers moved in their practiced column, their lookouts stationed in the positions that years of night-fighting doctrine had established as optimal, elevated, eyes adapted to the dark, scanning the water on arcs that the tactical manual prescribed. Japanese naval lookouts were genuinely exceptional by any measure. They had been selected for their visual acuity, trained for months in night observation, and had accumulated operational experience in precisely these waters. On earlier nights, in earlier battles, those lookouts had been the decisive intelligence asset. They had seen American ships before American ships saw them, and they had handed their commanders the crucial seconds of warning that long-lance torpedoes turned into catastrophe. But the eyes of the finest lookouts in any navy are bounded by the physics of human vision. They cannot see what is not producing light. They cannot see through rain. They cannot resolve a hull-down silhouette at 4,000 meters against a dark and turbulent sea. Radar had no such limitations. The surface search sets sweeping from Moosbrugger's destroyers were indifferent to darkness. They returned the same reliable echo from a steel hull at night as they would in full daylight. They were not confused by the absence of phosphorescence. They did not tire. They did not blink. They did not feel the particular anxiety that grips a man standing a night watch on the deck of a warship heading into waters where ships have been known to disappear without warning. The radar operators felt anxiety of a different kind, the fear of losing a contact, of misreading a return, of calling something that wasn't there or missing something that was. But that anxiety sharpened their focus, rather than degrading their function. And on the night of the 6th of August, they performed with the steadiness that the moment required. As the two formations continued to close, the radar picture aboard Moosbrugger's ships became progressively clearer and more detailed. Individual contacts within the Japanese column began to separate on screen as the range decreased, allowing the operators to distinguish the lead ship from those following and to develop an increasingly accurate picture of the column's course and speed. That information was critical to the attack geometry. Moosbrugger was working to achieve his first division needed to reach a position from which torpedo tracks would run across the Japanese line of advance at an angle favorable for multiple hits, and every mile of maneuvering room consumed in reaching that position was calculated against what the radar returns were telling him about how fast the Japanese were moving and where they would be when weapons hit the water. It was navigation and ballistics solved in real time, in darkness, by men who had studied these calculations and now had to trust that study. The Japanese column gave no sign of detecting the American presence. There were no alterations, of course, no increases in speed, no signals of the kind that would suggest heightened alert. The formation maintained the steady, businesslike progress of a force that expects to meet no opposition or that has met opposition here before and emerged the winner. Their confidence was not irrational. The Tokyo Express had earned it run by run, battle by battle. Through waters these same hulls had churned before. The men aboard those 4 destroyers had reason to believe that the night belonged to them in the way it had always belonged to them. Their lookouts were doing what lookouts were supposed to do. Their ships were at the speed the mission required. They were the Tokyo Express, and they were delivering. What they could not know, what no lookout, however gifted, however experienced, could have told them, was that 6 American ships were watching their every move from the darkness, tracked not by human eyes but by pulses of invisible energy bouncing back from their hulls through 3,000 meters of black water. The radar operators sat in their small, warm rooms and watched the green sweeps come around, and every sweep the Japanese contacts came in a little stronger, a little more resolved, a little more undeniably real. In the spaces between those sweeps, in the second of darkness before the next rotation, The operators waited with the particular patience of men who understand that the most important thing they can do right now is nothing except watch. No report unless there is something to report. No adjustment unless the picture changes. No conversation that is not necessary. Just the screen and the sweep and the slowly tightening geometry of what was coming. Aboard the flagship, Moosbrugger had the picture he needed. The Japanese column was where the radar said it was, moving at the speed the radar said it was moving, on the course the radar said it was steering. His own division was close to the position the plan required. The second division, under Commander Roger Simpson, was holding its station in the dark water to the east, waiting for the sequence that Moosbrugger had built into the attack. Torpedoes first, guns after. No gun illumination until the torpedoes had run their course. It was a plan constructed around a technology the Japanese did not have and a discipline the United States Navy had paid in blood to develop. The torpedo tubes were trained out, the fire control teams had their solutions, the radar operators watched their screens. And in the darkness of Vella Gulf, 4 Japanese destroyers sailed on, their lookouts scanning the empty water, finding nothing to alarm them, finding nothing at all. The radar screens told a story that words could not yet confirm. Somewhere out there in the darkness of Vella Gulf, 4 Japanese destroyers were moving in column formation, their hulls cutting south through water they believed they owned. The American operators watching those glowing returns knew exactly what they were looking at, not ghosts, not coastline scatter, not the ambiguous clutter that had confused so many radar plots in so many previous engagements in the slot. These were ships, moving at speed, on a heading that placed them precisely where intelligence had said they would be. The geometry was already beginning to resolve itself into something that, for the first time in a long string of nights in these waters, favoured the men doing the watching rather than the men being watched. Moosbrugger studied the picture on his bridge with the calm that his crews had come to recognise, not as detachment, but as concentration, the stillness of a man whose mind is working faster than his expression lets on. He had planned for this moment, and the plan was holding. The 2 divisions had been positioned with deliberate care in the hours before contact. Moosbrugger's own 3 destroyers, the 1st Division, held the western side of the Gulf, angled so that when the Japanese column passed, they would present their broadsides to it, the ideal geometry for a torpedo attack, offering the widest possible firing arc and the greatest chance of a clean solution. The 2nd Division, under Commander Roger Simpson, ran roughly parallel but offset to the east, positioned to follow the torpedo strike with gunfire and to cut off any Japanese attempt to turn and run north. The spacing between the 2 divisions was not accidental. It was the product of hours of planning, of Moosbrugger working through the angles on paper and in his head, calculating what would happen if the Japanese zigged, what would happen if they accelerated, what happened if his torpedoes ran long or short. There was no arrangement that eliminated every risk, but there was one that managed risk better than the alternatives, and Moosbrugger believed he had found it. He had made one thing absolutely clear to every captain under his command. The guns would stay silent until the torpedoes had done their work. Speed became the instrument of geometry in those final miles of approach. Moosbrugger reduced his division to slow ahead, barely making way to minimize the white water boiling at each destroyer's bow, the kind of luminescent churn that a Japanese lookout, however briefly, might catch with his eyes before any weapon could catch him. The slower they moved, the less they disturbed the surface, and the surface at night in the Solomons was treacherous in both directions. It could betray you as easily as it could hide you. Every knot shaved from their speed was a knot of concealment purchased. The Japanese column, by contrast, was moving at the kind of speed that delivered drums on schedule and got destroyers back north before daylight, the operational tempo that had made the Tokyo Express effective, but that also, in this particular geometry, was now delivering them into the mouth of something they could not see. The contrast between the 2 formations in those minutes was absolute. One group pressing forward with confident momentum, the other nearly motionless, waiting with the patience of a thing that has already decided what will happen next. On the bridge of each American destroyer, the atmosphere was caught between the mundane and the electric. Men who had eaten their evening meal a few hours before now stood at their stations in the dark, hands finding familiar equipment by touch, eyes adjusted to the blackness outside the portholes. The torpedo crews had been at their stations long enough that the tension had passed through its first sharp peak and settled into something more sustained and harder to carry, a low, persistent alertness that made every sound on deck feel louder than it was. The fire control teams below fed data into their solutions with the methodical rhythm that training had made automatic. Bearing, range, speed, angle on the bow. Each update from the radar operators arrived as a small but significant refinement, the picture sharpening the way a lens sharpens when the right focal length is found. The solution was not yet perfect, but it was getting there, and everyone in those compartments knew that Moosbrugger would not fire until it was as close to perfect as the situation allowed. There is a quality to the minutes before violent action that survivors often describe in similar terms, regardless of their nationality, their branch of service, or the decade in which they fought. Time does not speed up, it slows, or it seems to, because perception sharpens so dramatically that individual seconds carry more information than they normally would. A man notices the texture of the deck beneath his feet, the temperature of the air on the back of his neck, the sound of another man breathing 2 feet away. He does not think about these things consciously. The conscious mind is occupied entirely with function, with the immediate task at hand. But the body records everything with a fidelity that memory preserves long after the event has ended. For the men on Moosbrugger's destroyers in those minutes, the dark water around them was not abstract. It was the same water that had swallowed their fellow sailors at Savo, at Tassafaronga, at a dozen lesser engagements that never made the newspapers. They knew what this water did to ships and to men. They were choosing to be here anyway, because the alternative, allowing the Tokyo Express to run unopposed, had already proven its own kind of catastrophe. The range closed with a mechanical inevitability that the radar made visible and the human nervous system translated into something close to physical pressure. Moosbrugger watched it, his exec watched it. The captains of his 2 other destroyers watched their own radar plots and understood from the numbers what the 1st Division's relative position meant, that the geometry was tightening toward its designed resolution. There would be a moment, and the moment was coming, when the angle was right, and the range was right, and the solution was locked, and at that moment he would give the order, not before. Everything they had learned from Tassafaronga, from every night action that had gone wrong because someone fired too early or maneuvered too late, compressed itself into one operational discipline: wait. The Japanese column pressed on, its lookouts scanning the darkness between the island masses, finding nothing, because nothing is exactly what 6 American destroyers had decided to look like. The bearing to the Japanese column had been steady for long enough that Moosbrugger could read what it meant. A steady bearing and a closing range meant they were on an intercept course, which was exactly what he had calculated. The Japanese were not zigzagging. They were running their standard express route with the predictability that efficiency demands and that tactical surprise exploits. Their lead destroyer was now close enough that the radar return was sharp and clean, the trailing ships visible in the plot as distinct returns rather than a smeared cluster. Moosbrugger could count them. 4 ships. The same 4 ships that intelligence had promised. The drum cargo those destroyers carried had done something to their combat readiness. It had displaced crew from stations, occupied deck space, altered the silhouettes that his radar was now reading so cleanly. He did not know the precise details of what was on their decks. He knew what his radar showed, and it showed 4 ships in column sailing into the best torpedo solution he was ever likely to get. The fire control solution reached the threshold that training defined as optimum. Moosbrugger did not hesitate, and he did not pause for ceremony. The order went out in the flat, functional language of naval combat, compressed, unambiguous, carrying in its brevity the full weight of everything that had led to this moment. The crews who had been holding their readiness for what felt like much longer than it actually was, responded with the automatic precision that repetition produces, releasing the catch on months of institutional learning, tactical failure, doctrinal argument, and quiet preparation. The torpedo tubes trained to their firing angles. The first weapons left their tubes with the compressed air percussion that vibrated through every deck and bulkhead in the ship, not an explosion but a hard, industrial exhalation, like the sound of something very large letting go of a breath it had been holding. Then more, from the next mount, and the next ship in the division, and the next after that, each release adding to a spread that fanned out into the black water and disappeared. 24 torpedoes were now in the water. Nobody aboard Moosbrugger's ships could see them. There was nothing to watch, no visible trail, no signal that the weapons were running true or running at all. The crews stood at their empty tubes in the dark and waited, and the water gave nothing back. This was the hardest moment in any torpedo action, the interval between launch and impact during which a man has done everything he can do and has now surrendered agency entirely to physics and probability. The Japanese column continued moving. Their lookouts were still scanning. Their captains were still reading their charts. The drums destined for Kolombangara were still lashed to their decks. For a matter of minutes, nothing in the visible world had changed at all, and Vella Gulf held its silence with the absolute indifference of deep water. Moosbrugger's bridge was quiet. The radar operators spoke in low, necessary words, tracking the Japanese returns as they continued to close. The fire control teams were already recalculating, watching the plot update, their training carrying them forward into the next phase of engagement even while the first phase was still in transit beneath the surface. The captains of the 2nd Division were watching their own screens, their gun crews closed up and ready, waiting for the signal that would be impossible to miss. The plan called for the guns to stay silent, and the guns stayed silent. In the darkness, 24 weapons were running their courses through water that did not know what they carried or what they were about to do. Moosbrugger watched the clock and the radar screen and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. Everything that needed to be done had been done. Everything that was about to happen was already in motion, invisible beneath the surface of a sea that, for a few more seconds, was completely still. The order came quietly. Not a shout, not a broadcast across the formation, just the word passed through each ship's command chain with the controlled urgency of men who had rehearsed this moment until it lived inside their hands. On the bridges of Moosbrugger's 1st Division, the final firing solutions had already been locked in. The radar picture was clean. The geometry was exactly what the planning sessions had promised it would be. The Japanese column was there, moving at speed, perfectly framed against the dark water of Vella Gulf, and it had no idea what was waiting for it on the beam. The torpedo tubes trained out, 24 weapons in total, distributed across the 3 destroyers of the 1st Division, each one set to its assigned depth and running angle, each one a product of the careful solution feeding that had occupied the fire control teams through those final tense minutes of approach. The crews at the tubes felt the shudder as the first weapons left their mounts, not the violent concussion of an explosion, but something almost mechanical, almost gentle by comparison, the compressed air thump of each torpedo clearing its tube and entering the sea. One after another, in the disciplined sequence that Moosbrugger's planning had prescribed, they went into the water. Within a matter of seconds, the full spread was running. And then came the waiting. This is the part that defies easy description, because in those minutes after launch, the battle existed in a state of suspension that the men aboard those destroyers would remember for the rest of their lives. The water above the weapons showed nothing. The surface of the Gulf was dark, occasionally fractured by the low chop of a passing swell, and somewhere beneath it, 24 weapons were running at speed toward a column of ships that continued to move forward in tight formation, their crews still scanning the night with their eyes, still trusting the darkness to protect them. The Japanese destroyers did not slow, they did not scatter. They pressed on up the slot exactly as they had pressed on dozens of times before, carrying their drums of supplies, keeping their station. The running time for weapons fired at that range was measured in minutes, not seconds. 2 minutes. 2.5. The men on the American bridges watched the clock and watched the radar repeaters and kept their radio silence and waited. The 2nd Division was holding position, as instructed, ready to come in with gunfire once the torpedoes had done their work. The separation of those two functions, the clean division between the torpedo strike and the gun action, was the whole architecture of Moosbrugger's plan, and in those suspended minutes before detonation, every man in the formation was holding his piece of it together through sheer discipline. The first explosion arrived without warning from the perspective of the Japanese column. There was no preceding alarm, no moment of recognition before impact, just the sudden, total detonation of a warhead against a destroyer's hull at speed. The force of it was not merely structural. A fully laden destroyer, moving at more than 30 knots, carries an enormous reserve of energy in its own motion. And when a torpedo intersects that motion, the result is a transfer of forces that the ship's frame was never designed to absorb. The initial detonation opened the hull. What came next? The flooding, the rupturing of fuel lines, the cascading pressure on watertight compartments that were never intended to hold against that kind of shock, happened in the space of heartbeats. Then the second explosion, then the third. In rapid, staggered succession, across a stretch of dark water that had been calm 30 seconds before, 3 of the 4 Japanese destroyers were struck. The interval between the first and the last detonation was short enough that to observers on the American bridges, the sequence read almost as continuous, a rolling series of eruptions spreading down the Japanese column like something catastrophic passing through a linked chain. The Gulf lit up, not gradually, not with the slow bloom of a distant fire. It lit up with the sudden, absolute violence of magazines detonating, of fuel catching, of the internal architecture of warships being unmade from the inside out. A destroyer's magazine, when it cooks off, produces a light of extraordinary intensity. The men on Moosbrugger's bridges would later describe it in different ways. Some recalled the colour, others the sheer vertical reach of the fireballs climbing above the water, others the way the flash preceded the sound by several seconds, so that you saw the ships dying before you heard them. The sound, when it arrived, was not a single bang but a layered, rolling concussion, the initial warhead, the secondary explosions within the hull, the magazine going, and underneath all of it, a low, sustained rumbling that carried across the water and through the hulls of the American ships themselves, felt in the feet and the chest as much as heard. Men who had been at sea since Guadalcanal said they had not experienced anything quite like it. What the radar screens showed in those moments was equally stark, but in a different register entirely. Where there had been 4 discrete contacts moving in column, there were now contacts behaving in ways that contacts on a radar screen were not supposed to behave, slowing, breaking formation, one of them still moving and accelerating away to the north, while the others ceased to resolve as coherent shapes. The operators watching those screens understood what they were seeing. 3 ships that had been underway a minute before were no longer underway in any meaningful sense. The column that had carried supplies to Column Bangara through night after night of unchallenged runs was, in the space of 2 minutes of running time and a handful of detonations, effectively gone. The completeness of it was difficult to process in real time. The men aboard the American destroyers had trained for an outcome like this, had discussed it in the planning sessions, had been told by Moosbrugger that if the geometry held and the discipline held, then the result could be decisive. But discussion and the actual event are separated by a distance that no amount of preparation fully closes. On the bridges, captains who had been tightly wound through the entire approach now found themselves looking at a horizon that was burning, at a stretch of sea they had crossed in careful darkness that was now illuminated by the light of ships that had been their opponents. The reaction was not celebration, not immediately, it was something closer to a stunned, concentrated alertness. The instinct of professionals who understood that the engagement was not over and that one ship was still out there. That one surviving destroyer had broken north at the first detonations. Whatever its crew's exact understanding of what had happened to the ships behind them, their response was immediate speed, smoke, distance. In the time it took the American formation to process what the radar was showing, the 4th ship had already opened a significant gap. The 2nd Division, which had been holding back through the torpedo phase exactly as planned, was now the instrument Moosbrugger would use to pursue. But the burning stretch of water between the American formation and the fleeing destroyer told its own story about what kind of night this had been, and the geometry of pursuit into the slot's northern approaches carried its own risks. The decision about what to do next would have to be made quickly. But before the formation turned its attention fully north, there was a moment, brief, unrecorded in any official document, existing only in the recollections of the men who were there when the whole of Vella Gulf seemed to demand a pause. 3 destroyers. Ships that had been moving, living, crewed by hundreds of men, carrying the routine of a supply run they had made before and expected to make again. They were gone. Not disabled, not retreating gone, or very nearly so, their hulls already in the process of finding the floor of the Gulf. The water around the wreckage was lit by fires that would burn for some time yet, casting a moving, orange light across the surface, illuminating the debris fields and the supply drums that the ships had been carrying. The whole material purpose of the Tokyo Express run, scattered now across the same dark water it had been meant to cross. Moose Brugger's formation had not fired its guns yet. The entire opening phase of the battle had been conducted in something close to silence from the American side. The compressed air thump of tubes launching, the hum of machinery, the quiet voice traffic of crews coordinating in the dark. The destruction that now spread across the surface of Vella Gulf had been delivered entirely by weapons that the Japanese column had never seen coming, running unseen beneath the surface, arriving without the warning that gunfire gives. It was, in the most precise tactical sense, exactly what Moose Brugger had designed it to be. A torpedo ambush executed with enough discipline and enough accuracy that 3 ships had been struck before a single Japanese lookout had a chance to understand what was happening. The slot had swallowed ships before. On this night, in this particular stretch of water, it had swallowed them at American direction. The northern end of Vella Gulf swallowed the 4th destroyer whole. Not in the way the other 3 had been swallowed, not in fire and concussion and the sudden catastrophic unmaking of steel, but in the older, quieter way that the sea has always taken things. Into darkness, into distance, into the confusion that follows when a battle shifts from ambush to pursuit. One ship had survived, and the men aboard her knew it. Her captain had no time to process what had happened to the ships astern of him. There was no pause for understanding, no moment of reckoning. The sea behind him was lit by detonations that turned the surface of Vella Gulf into something resembling dawn. 3 false dawns arriving in rapid, terrible succession. And the instinct driving that bridge was not to understand, but to move. The surviving destroyer turned hard, pushed her engines toward their limit, and reached for the north. She had been at the rear of the Japanese column, and that single accident of position, the most ordinary kind of luck, the luck of sequence, was all that separated her from the fate of the ships ahead. Her cargo of supply drums still sat aboard her, her crew was intact, her torpedoes had not yet been fired, and she was running. Smoke came first. The Japanese destroyer laid it deliberately, trailing a chemical curtain between herself and the American guns that were now swinging to bear. It was a practiced maneuver, drilled into the muscle memory of destroyer crews on both sides of the Pacific. The smallest ship's oldest defense. Deny your enemy the clean line of sight that fire control demands. In the darkness and the residual chaos of 3 simultaneous detonations, the smoke worked well enough to buy critical seconds. Moose Brugger's 1st Division had expended its torpedoes and was now managing the immediate aftermath of the attack, adjusting course, confirming results, assessing what its radar was telling it. The job of pursuit fell to the 2nd Division, which had been held back precisely for this contingency, the moment when the torpedo attack succeeded and a fleeing enemy needed to be run down. Commander Roger Simpson's ships accelerated onto a northward heading and began the chase. The geometry of it was straightforward enough on paper. The 2nd Division had guns, it had speed, and it had a radar return to follow. But the waters ahead were not a clean, open ocean. They were the slot at its most treacherous, the narrows between Colombangara and Vella La Vella, where the coastlines closed in and the radar picture began to fill with land returns that blurred the distinction between a fleeing warship and a point of solid ground. The Japanese destroyer had home water advantage in the most practical sense. Her captain knew these passages. He had run them before. The American commanders pursuing him could not say the same. The guns spoke across the water as Simpson's destroyers pressed the chase, and the exchange that followed was not the clean violence of the torpedo ambush. It was the messier, less decisive business of a stern chase at night, with the target zigging inside smoke and the range fluctuating as both sides adjusted speed and course. American radar tracked the return as best it could, but smoke and speed and the irregular geometry of the coastline all conspired to degrade the fire control solution. Shells landed in the water. Some landed close. The Japanese ship took fire, accounts suggesting she was struck at least once, enough to confirm the American guns were finding her, not enough to stop her. She kept moving. She kept producing smoke. She kept opening the range. The calculation on Moosbrugger's bridges was not simple. A pursuing force in unfamiliar waters at night, following a damaged but still capable enemy who had not yet fired her torpedoes, is not in a position of simple advantage. The Long Lance was the shadow over every decision made in the slot that year, the weapon that had punished American aggressiveness time and again. A Japanese destroyer captain with nothing left to lose and a full torpedo battery remaining was among the most dangerous things the Pacific produced. Every nautical mile that Moosbrugger's ships pushed further north was another nautical mile deeper into waters where a well-timed torpedo spread could produce a different kind of headline. The victory already secured behind them, 3 ships destroyed, 0 American losses made the risk calculus of the pursuit feel very different from the risk calculus of the original attack. What had been gained could not be lost to a single vengeful spread. The decision to break off the pursuit was reached not dramatically, but pragmatically, the way professional sailors make hard choices when the numbers stop adding up. The fleeing destroyer was damaged, trailing smoke, her resupply mission an absolute failure regardless of whether she survived the night. The drums she carried would never reach Kolombangara. The troops she was supposed to sustain would go without. From a strategic standpoint, the objective of the interception had been achieved 3 times over, and the 4th ship's escape, costly and humiliating as it might feel in the abstract, changed none of that. What it would have changed, dramatically, was the American butcher's bill had one of Simpson's destroyers been caught broadside by a Long Lance in those dark, confined waters while hunting her. Moosbrugger understood this. He brought his ships back. The Japanese destroyer made it through. She cleared the northern exit of the slot and put sea room between herself and the catastrophe she had left behind. Her crew would have understood by then, at least in rough outline, what had happened to the 3 ships that had been ahead of them in the column. The fires would have been visible astern for some time. The silence on the radio frequencies that should have carried voices from the other captains would have told its own story. There is something particular about surviving the destruction of your entire formation, something that sits differently than an ordinary near miss, a weight that lands after the adrenaline has finished burning. The men of that ship had been spared by their position in the column, by a margin they had done nothing to earn, and they carried that knowledge home with them. On the American side, the escape of the 4th destroyer was noted and analysed, but it did not diminish the mood that settled over Moosbrugger's formation as it turned south. The battle had been decided in minutes. 3 of 4 enemy ships were gone. The resupply mission had been shattered. No American ship had been seriously damaged. These were the facts that mattered, and they were so far from anything the South Pacific Command had come to expect from a night action in the slot that the instinct of the men involved was almost to distrust them, to wait for the correction, the hidden cost, the casualty report that would make the ledger look more like the ones that had come before. No such correction arrived. The 4th ship's escape was the single asterisk on a clean page, and clean pages had been rare enough in these waters that sailors could afford to absorb that asterisk without it spoiling what they had done. There is a tactical argument, made after the fact by analysts who had the luxury of daylight and stillness, that a more aggressive pursuit might have finished the job completely. That argument does not survive contact with the conditions that existed on those bridges at that hour of that morning. Commanders make decisions with the information they have, under time pressures that no post-mortem can fully reconstruct. And the information Moosbrugger's captains had was that they were being asked to drive deeper into confined waters at speed, chasing a still-armed enemy who knew those waters better than they did. When the mission assigned to them had already been accomplished beyond any reasonable expectation, the decision to disengage was not timidity. It was the trained, professional judgment of men who understood that a battle already won is not a bet to be doubled. For the Japanese side, the surviving destroyer arrived back at her base carrying a burden that went beyond her hull damage and her failed mission. She was the sole witness to what had happened in Vella Gulf. Her captain's report would be the primary account from which Japanese Naval Command would have to reconstruct the night. And what that account described a formation annihilated without apparent warning by weapons that arrived before any hostile ship had been seen, with a speed and totality that matched nothing in the accumulated experience of the Tokyo Express, would force a reckoning that no victory bulletin could soften. The Express had run the slot dozens of times. It had beaten the Americans repeatedly. It had become, within the strategic culture of the Japanese Navy, a reliable instrument, something that could be counted on the way you count on a strong current or a known anchorage. After the night of the 6th of August, 1943, that certainty was gone. The escape of one ship, then, was not a failure that offset the victory. It was, in its own way, part of the story the battle would tell. The fourth destroyer made it home. She reported what she had seen, and the report she carried of 3 ships gone in minutes, of an enemy using invisible weapons from positions that had never been identified, landed in Japanese planning rooms like a cold draft from a door left open on a night when the weather has changed. The Tokyo Express had survived Vella Gulf in the narrowest technical sense. 1 ship, 1 crew, 1 captain navigating the dark passage north with smoke behind him and silence on the radio. But the confidence that had made it the terror of the slot had not survived with them. That, too, went down with the other 3 ships, and no rescue mission would ever bring it back. The fires died faster than anyone expected. One moment Vella Gulf was lit from horizon to horizon, the water surface broken by secondary explosions that sent columns of orange light climbing into the overcast sky. Then, with a finality that felt almost deliberate, the burning stopped. Darkness returned, not the gradual dimming of a fire burning down, but the sudden, absolute black that follows when a ship stops existing. And in that darkness, the Gulf was not empty. It was full of men. 3 destroyers had gone down in minutes. Each vessel had carried a crew of well over 100 sailors, and the supply runs of the Tokyo Express had also placed additional army troops aboard for delivery to Kolombangara's garrison. The arithmetic was brutal. Spread across miles of open water, in the deep of an equatorial night, hundreds of men were now swimming, clinging to wreckage, calling out to voices they could not locate in the dark. Some had been thrown clear by the force of the explosions. Others had gone into the water as their ships rolled and sank beneath them. The lucky ones had found something to hold. The unlucky ones were managing the physics of staying afloat with injuries they could not yet fully feel, sustained in the first seconds of a violence so overwhelming that the body's defences had temporarily masked its own damage. Moosbrugger's ships knew. The radar picture had shown the destruction clearly, and as his 2 divisions completed their manoeuvre and the immediate tactical situation resolved, the American commanders faced a question that has confronted every naval officer who has won a night engagement in confined hostile waters. The survivors in the water were enemy combatants, soldiers and sailors of an empire still very much at war, some of them potentially armed, all of them in a location that was not safe for American ships to linger. The waters off Kolombangara were within range of Japanese shore-based aircraft. The 4th destroyer had escaped northward and might return with reinforcements or call in an airstrike before dawn. Stopping to rescue survivors, in that context, meant placing 6 American ships and roughly 1,200 American sailors in danger for the sake of men whose own military code of conduct made them deeply unlikely to accept rescue willingly. The calculations were not made coldly. They were made under the pressure of a clock that was running hard toward dawn. Moosbrugger was not a man given to sentiment in tactical decisions. but neither was he indifferent to the human reality his weapons had created in the water below. What he faced was the compressed moral geometry that commanders in that war faced routinely, and that history tends to soften in the retelling. A rescue attempt in those waters, at that hour, was not simply dangerous, it was tactically indefensible. Every minute his destroyers spent stationary or slow-moving in Vella Gulf was a minute closer to the window of Japanese air response. He had achieved something no American surface force had managed in the slot in nearly a year of fighting. He was not going to lose it in the aftermath. The decision was made to withdraw. It was the decision any responsible commander in that position would have made, and it was the decision that would haunt the accounting of this battle in ways that the clean tactical numbers never quite captured. Moose Brugger's ships turned for home in the final hours before sunrise, their torpedo tubes spent, their gun crews still at stations, their wakes curving south through waters that were now quiet except for the sounds of men calling out in Japanese across the dark surface of the Gulf. Those voices receded as the American destroyers accelerated. Whether any of the men aboard those ships heard them as they pulled away is not something that found its way into the official record. But in a warship at speed, sound travels in strange ways, and the Gulf was not large. What happened to the men in the water unfolded over hours and then days, in ways that were only partially reconstructed after the fact. Japanese naval doctrine placed enormous weight on the idea that defeat was dishonor, and that capture represented a failure of will rather than an act of survival. This was not merely propaganda, it was a genuinely held conviction among a significant proportion of the Imperial Japanese Navy's combat personnel, and it shaped what happened in Vella Gulf in the hours after the destroyers burned. Some survivors, facing the choice between attempting landfall on Kolombangara and waiting for rescue that might never come, chose neither. The distance to the nearest shoreline was considerable, and the currents in the Central Solomons at night are not cooperative. The men who had been garrison troops rather than trained sailors were at the greatest disadvantage, unaccustomed to the water, burdened perhaps by equipment they had not thought to shed in time, exhausted by the violence of what had happened to them. Japanese rescue efforts did come. They came cautiously, delayed by the same fear of American air power that had shaped Moose Brugger's decision to withdraw, and they operated under the same compressed window between darkness and the hours when American aircraft ranged freely over the Central Solomons. Small craft from Kolombangara made attempts to reach the area. Whether those attempts began that same night or waited for the following darkness is a question the surviving records do not answer with precision. What is known is that the number of men recovered was a fraction of the number who had gone into the water. The Gulf is deep, the currents unpredictable, and hours of immersion in equatorial waters carries its own attrition. The garrison troops aboard the 3 sunken destroyers represented a particular dimension of this human accounting that the clean tactical summary of the battle tends to obscure. These were not men who had chosen a naval engagement. They were soldiers being ferried to a posting, riding below decks, or crowded onto surfaces they were not trained to abandon under fire. The drum-drop resupply method used by the Tokyo Express had evolved partly because it minimized the time destroyers spent stationary and vulnerable in the slot, but carrying troops as cargo rather than supplies created a different kind of exposure entirely. When the torpedoes hit, those men had virtually no warning and no practiced response. The loss of life among them was likely disproportionate even to the scale of the sinkings themselves. For the garrison already on Kolombangara, the non-arrival of those supplies and reinforcements registered first as absence, and then, as dawn came and no word arrived from the supply run, as a deepening certainty. The island's defenders were already stretched. The resupply mission that never arrived represented not just the loss of materiel and personnel, but the beginning of a calculation that the island's commanders would be running for weeks afterward. How long could they hold on a shrinking margin of resources, with American forces tightening their grip on the surrounding sea lanes? The men who died in Vella Gulf that night were, in one sense, victims of the engagement itself. In another sense, they were already victims of the strategic situation men being sent through dangerous waters to sustain a position that was becoming harder to defend with every passing week. the question of survivors lingered in the American after-action process, in a way that is worth pausing on. The United States Navy in that period of the war was grappling with a tension it did not always manage cleanly. The impulse toward humanitarian conduct that is embedded in maritime tradition, running against the hard operational realities of a conflict fought at extreme range with no margin for sentiment. Rescue of enemy survivors was not standard practice in night surface engagements in the Solomons in 1943. The reasons were tactical, temporal, and practical in roughly equal measure. But the knowledge that hundreds of men were in the water and that American ships had chosen withdrawal over rescue was not something that disappeared cleanly from the minds of the men who had made that choice and those who had carried it out. What the historical record preserves, imperfectly, is the scale of loss on the Japanese side. 3 destroyers gone, each with a crew, each with passengers, each with the accumulated skill and institutional knowledge of a navy that had until recently dominated these waters. The number of men who did not survive the night of the 6th of August, 1943, runs into the hundreds. The exact figure is not established with certainty, and perhaps it never will be. Ships sunk quickly in deep water leave incomplete manifests. Rescue operations conducted under enemy air threat leave incomplete logs. And a navy that valued stoicism over documentation did not always preserve the granular human accounting that later historians required. What we know is that the water off Kolombangara held more dead than living by the time the sun came up over the Solomon Islands that morning. There is a kind of irony, quiet and uncomfortable, in the fact that the battle, which American naval historians would come to celebrate as a nearly flawless tactical execution, owed a portion of its clean ledger, no American ships damaged, no American lives lost, to the decision not to linger in those waters. The very discipline and operational judgment that made the victory complete also meant that the men it left in the water were left entirely. That is not a judgment on Moosbrugger or on the men who followed his orders. It is simply the full picture of what happened in Vella Gulf after the torpedoes ran and the fires went out. Wars are not clean, and their victories are not either. The tactical ledger and the human ledger are not the same document, and the Battle of Vella Gulf, for all its achievement, wrote entries in both. The destroyers came home in the dark. They moved south through the slot at speed, their wakes white and churning against black water, their hulls unmarked by so much as a single enemy shell. Below decks and on open weather stations, men stood or sat in the particular silence that follows violence at a distance, the kind of silence that belongs not to peace, but to the pause between understanding what you have done and fully believing it. Torpedo crews who had watched their weapons run out into the night now leaned against steel and said very little. Gun crews whose guns had never even fired stood at their stations and tried to organize what they had seen into something they could carry. The fires were behind them now, over the horizon and fading, but the men who had watched them from the bridges of 6 American destroyers were still seeing them with the eyes closed. Commander Moosbrugger held his position on the bridge as the formation pressed southward. He was not a man given to premature celebration, and the reports he had been assembling in his mind since the moment the first torpedo found its mark had not yet hardened into anything he would call certainty. He knew 3 ships had been hit. He knew the detonations had been catastrophic. He knew that what his radar showed in the minutes afterward, the fading, disintegrating returns, where a column of 4 destroyers had been told a story of near total destruction. But in the Pacific War, in the slot especially, the gap between what a man believed and what had actually happened had already swallowed more than one American commander's reputation. Moosbrugger waited. He kept the formation tight, kept the ships moving, and let the hours between Vella Gulf and base do their work. Aboard every ship, the mood was something that did not have a clean name. Elation was part of it, the sudden, almost physical relief of emerging from an engagement that everyone had expected to cost them dearly, and instead finding the sea around them quiet and their ships whole. Men who had prepared themselves for incoming torpedo fire, for the alarm that meant flooding, for the concussive shock of a hit, those men were now aboard an undamaged vessel, heading home at speed, and the distance between what they had feared and what had happened was almost too large to cross in a single night. But caution lived alongside the elation, and experience was the reason. These were sailors who knew what the slot had taken from other men in other actions. They had heard the stories. Some of them had been in the stories. They were not going to light up the radio or shout across the water until they were somewhere safer, and they were not going to fully exhale until the anchorage was in sight. The radio traffic that reached American headquarters in those early morning hours was fragmentary by design. Moose Brugger's force had maintained strict discipline throughout the engagement and the return passage, and the dispatches that came in were careful, measured things, statements of action taken, weapons expended, contacts observed, results assessed as probable. The word probable carried real meaning in that context. It was the word of a professional who had seen the explosions, counted the burning hulls, watched the radar screens show empty water where ships had been, and still declined to call it confirmed until someone else could corroborate it. In the intelligence and operations sections where those dispatches landed, officers sat with the incoming traffic and worked the problem methodically. 4 contacts, torpedo attack executed, 3 contacts destroyed or severely damaged, 1 contact evaded northward, own force intact. It was almost too clean to be trusted. The atmosphere in those headquarters spaces in the small hours of the 7th of August was one of careful, almost suspicious attention. The South Pacific Command had been burned before by engagement reports that looked cleaner than the reality actions, where initial dispatches had claimed success only for subsequent analysis to reveal a far more complicated picture. The men reading Moose Brugger's reports were professionally skeptical, not because they doubted his competence, but because the history of the slot had taught them that the sea withheld its final accounting until dawn, sometimes longer. They cross-referenced, they compared the timeline of dispatches with what radar pickets and coast watchers might be able to confirm, and they resisted the urge to forward the story up the chain of command until they were confident they understood its shape. What they were reading, if it held together, would be unlike anything that had come out of the slot in a very long time. When Moose Brugger's destroyers finally raised their anchorage and came in off the water as the darkness began to thin toward grey, the men who met them at the pier or watched them from other ships in the harbour saw what they most needed to see: 6 ships returning where 6 had departed. No visible damage. No evidence of the kind of night that men in those waters had come to dread. The returning sailors came ashore carrying that particular quality of controlled exhaustion that sits on men who have been prepared for catastrophe and instead been handed a different kind of night entirely. They were tired, they were tight in the chest from hours of sustained alertness, and they were still working through what the last several hours meant. Debriefings began almost immediately, intelligence officers moving through crews with notebooks, pulling the pieces of the evening into an official account that could be checked against itself, against the torpedo logs, against the radar track records, against the observations of every officer who had held a watch during the engagement. The picture that assembled itself in those morning hours, one account at a time, was extraordinary in its consistency. The torpedo attack had gone exactly as Moose Brugger had designed it. The Japanese column had sailed into the spread without any apparent warning. 3 destroyers had been struck and destroyed in the time it takes a man to light a cigarette and look up from the flame. The 4th had run. American ships had pursued briefly and then correctly broken off. Not one American vessel had been touched by enemy fire. Not one American sailor had been killed. Piece by piece, as the debriefings continued, the outline of the engagement hardened from probable into confirmed, and word began to travel upward through the command structure with the particular velocity that good news earns after a long sequence of bad news. On the Japanese side, the silence was of a different quality entirely. The supply mission had departed with 4 destroyers and would not be returning with 4 destroyers. When the first indications of the disaster reached Japanese headquarters, they arrived the way most catastrophic news arrives, in wartime incomplete, confusing, and arriving from a direction that made the loss seem at first like a communication failure rather than a tactical one. A ship that should have reported did not report, then a second. The silence from the column was not immediately interpreted as destruction. It was interrogated as malfunction, as radio discipline, as the kind of operational gap that sometimes opened and then closed. It did not close. As the hours moved toward morning and the silence persisted, the realization settled in with the weight of something that cannot be argued with. 3 destroyers were gone. The garrison troops aboard them were gone. The supplies were gone. The mission had not merely failed, it had been annihilated. The shock on the Japanese side was amplified by the fact that nothing in recent experience had prepared their commanders for this outcome. The Tokyo Express had been running through the slot with an almost contemptuous efficiency. It had battered American formations, evaded interceptions, and delivered its supplies often enough to sustain the illusion that the corridor was Japanese water at night. The commanders who had built that confidence had done so on a real foundation, on genuine skill, on superior torpedoes, on the accumulated tactical learning of night after night in those waters. They were not reckless men, they were professionals who had won repeatedly in the same arena where they had now lost everything. The magnitude of the loss demanded explanation, and in the hours after dawn, the process of finding that explanation began, a process that would eventually surface the truth about American radar, about torpedo spreads launched from angles no lookout had been watching, about a new doctrine that had turned the Americans' technological advantage into a decisive weapon. Back at the American anchorage, as the sun came up over the islands and the debrief reports continued to accumulate into something coherent, a certain kind of energy moved through the men who had been on the water that night. It was not triumphalism. The Pacific had been in the business of punishing triumphalism for long enough that most men who had seen real service had learned to hold celebration at arm's length. It was something quieter and more durable than that. It was the recognition that they had done an extremely difficult thing extremely well, that the planning and the discipline and the technology had come together in precisely the sequence they were supposed to, and that the result was a kind of operational perfection that these waters had not seen before, not from the American side. The men who felt that recognition mostly felt it without saying it aloud, the way men who have been genuinely afraid and then genuinely lucky tend to process their relief. Moosbrugger himself, by the accounts of those who observed him in the hours after the return, was characteristically restrained. There was work to do, reports to finalize, equipment to account for, crews to stand down in proper order. The battle would have its full accounting in due time, and that accounting would be passed upward and forward and eventually into the institutional memory of the Navy by channels he did not need to manage personally. What he had needed to do was what he had done: take 6 destroyers into the slot, execute the plan with precision, bring every ship and every man home. The rest was someone else's job now. The morning was already well advanced, and somewhere north of them, past the islands and the smoke that had long since thinned into ordinary sky, a garrison on Kolombangara was waiting for supplies that would not come, and would not understand why for hours yet. The silence that Moosbrugger's destroyers had made the night before was settling now into the larger silence of consequence, the kind that takes days and weeks to measure and months to fully understand. The 7th of August, 1943, came in like any other morning in the islands, humid and bright, the water turning from black to blue-grey as the sun climbed. 6 American destroyers swung at anchor. Their crews slept or ate or sat with the particular looseness of men released from sustained tension. In the operations rooms and the intelligence sections, the reports were being filed and forwarded. In Japanese headquarters, men were beginning to draft messages they did not want to draft. The battle was over, but what it meant had barely begun to move through the world. When the last of Moosbrugger's destroyers crossed back into friendly waters before dawn, the men aboard had no complete picture of what they had done. They knew the torpedoes had struck. They had seen the light, those volcanic columns of orange and white, tearing open the black water of Vella Gulf, and they had heard the concussion rolling across the sea like something geological, like the island chain itself, shifting beneath the surface. But the full accounting, the precise and merciless arithmetic of what the night had produced, would take hours to assemble. It would require radio reports, debriefs, cross-reference sighting logs, and eventually the long, terrible silence from the Japanese side of the ledger. When the numbers finally resolved themselves into clarity, they would constitute something almost without precedent in the history of American destroyer warfare in the Solomon Islands. 3 Japanese destroyers had been sunk, not crippled, not beached, not abandoned, and burning through the night only to be salvaged in the morning, sunk. Gone to the floor of Vella Gulf with a completeness that the previous 2 years of fighting in the slot had rarely produced for either side without catastrophic cost. The Hagikaze, the Arashi, and the Kawakaze, 3 ships that had each made the run down the slot before, 3 ships crewed by men who knew these waters had been struck, broken, and swallowed within a time frame so compressed that the engagement barely qualified as a battle in the conventional sense. It was closer to an execution, and that word, however harsh it sounds applied to the work of warships, captures something truthful about the geometry of what Moosbrugger had arranged. The human cost on the Japanese side was staggering by any measure. Estimates derived from surviving accounts and subsequent investigations place the losses at somewhere in the region of 1,000 men, sailors, and soldiers combined, because the destroyers had been carrying garrison troops bound for Kolombangara in addition to their regular crews. Many of those soldiers would have had no combat role in a surface engagement. They were passengers, men sitting in the lower spaces of ships that were suddenly being torn apart around them, and many of them would have had no opportunity whatsoever to reach the water before their vessels were gone. For the experienced destroyer crews, men who understood their ships and could feel when one was dying, the window to escape was narrow. For the soldiers riding in those hulls as cargo, it may barely have existed at all. The sea that received them was dark, warm by the standards of the Pacific, and utterly indifferent to the distinction between combatant and passenger. Now place those numbers alongside everything that had come before. At Tassafaronga, fought roughly 8 months earlier in the same general theatre, the United States Navy had brought a powerful cruiser force to bear against a Japanese destroyer column and had suffered catastrophic losses. 1 heavy cruiser sunk and 3 more badly damaged, with hundreds of American sailors killed, while the Japanese had lost a single destroyer and completed a significant portion of their resupply mission. At the first Battle of Savo Island, even earlier, 4 Allied cruisers had been sent to the bottom in less than an hour, with a loss of life that shocked naval commanders across the Pacific. The accumulated weight of those defeats, the institutional memory of them, had saturated the culture of American surface warfare in the Solomons with a specific kind of dread. Men went into the slot knowing what it had already taken. They had heard the names of the sunken ships recited in ways that went beyond the merely informational. Against that backdrop, the accounting at Vella Gulf demanded a second and even a third reading. Not a single American ship had been damaged. Not by torpedo, not by gunfire, not by the kind of collision or navigational error that the dark confines of the slot had claimed even in the absence of enemy action. 6 destroyers had sailed in, prosecuted a precision attack against a formation of 4, and 6 destroyers had sailed out. The hulls were intact. The machinery was intact. The men were intact. In the entire course of the engagement, through the torpedo runs, the detonations, the pursuit of the surviving Japanese vessel, and the withdrawal back through the blackened water of the Gulf, the United States Navy had not lost a single life. The contrast with Tassafaronga, with Savo, with the entire grinding accumulation of American losses in these waters was not merely striking. It was almost incomprehensible to the men who had been living inside the older story. The resupply mission, the actual operational objective the Japanese had sent those 4 destroyers to accomplish, was an absolute and total failure. The drums, hundreds of them filled with food and medical supplies and ammunition intended for the isolated garrison on Kolombangara, had never left the ships. They went down with the hulls that carried them, or they were scattered across the surface in the aftermath, drifting in the dark without anyone to retrieve them. The garrison troops who had been aboard as passengers, those destined to reinforce the defences on Kolombangara, were dead or in the water. The island received nothing that night. Not a kilogram of rice, not a single soldier, not the smallest signal that Tokyo's ability to sustain it was holding together. The entire mechanism of the Tokyo Express, the logistical instrument that had kept Japanese garrisons supplied across the central Solomons for months, had been switched off for one night with violent finality. The immediate strategic consequence for Kolombangara was not subtle. The garrison there had been accumulating through the same kind of destroyer runs, the same night logistics chain that Moosbrugger had just dismantled in a matter of minutes. Those troops, more than 10,000 of them by some estimates, had been placed on Kolombangara partly because Japanese planners expected the Americans to assault the island directly after securing New Georgia, a logical progression up the island chain. The garrison's ability to resist, or to remain viable as a threat, depended entirely on continued resupply. Without food, medical supplies, and reinforcements arriving through the slot, 10,000 men on a jungle island became not a garrison, but a slow deterioration. The night of the 6th of August had not severed that lifeline permanently, but it had demonstrated with brutal clarity that the Tokyo Express was no longer running on schedule, no longer running safely, and no longer running without cost. There is something worth dwelling on in the specific quality of the American victory beyond the raw numbers. Previous American successes in the Solomons, where they had occurred, had frequently come at the cost of ships damaged, men wounded or killed, tactical positions compromised. A win in the slot had generally meant that you won while also absorbing punishment. The calculus of the grinding campaign demanded that sailors count their victories in terms of what they had lost to achieve them, and the exchange rates had rarely been favourable. What Moosbrugger had produced was categorically different. It was a clean transaction, the kind of outcome that tacticians model in planning rooms but rarely encounter in practice, where the attacking force imposed maximum destruction on the enemy while absorbing zero in return. That asymmetry was not accidental, and it was not luck. It was the product of preparation, positioning, and a discipline that held even when every instinct in a night action would have pushed toward premature aggression. For the Japanese garrison on Kolombangara, the nights after Vella Gulf brought a kind of silence that was itself communicative. The Tokyo Express had run with such reliability, such mechanical consistency, that its absence was felt as immediately as its presence had been. Men waiting for supplies that did not arrive understood, in the way that isolated soldiers understand things, that something had changed in the world beyond their island. They did not know the details of what had happened in Vella Gulf. They did not need to. The empty sea told them enough. And in the weeks that followed, as American planners absorbed the lessons of the engagement and Japanese planners absorbed its losses, the strategic situation around Kolombangara would begin to move in ways that the garrison could feel but could not stop. The figure of roughly 1,000 men lost deserves a moment of still consideration before the analysis moves forward. They were not abstractions. They were experienced sailors, men who had run this same passage before and survived it, men who had built the Tokyo Express into something that American commanders genuinely feared. They were soldiers shipped south as reinforcements, men who likely knew very little about the waters through which they were traveling. They were officers who had drilled their crews to a standard of night-fighting proficiency that no other navy in the Pacific could match at that stage of the war. They died in a few seconds of coordinated torpedo fire, in the dark, without warning, and the majority of them left no account of what those final moments were. Wars create these asymmetries between the record and the reality, between the clean language of operational accounting and the human content of what that accounting summarizes. The 6 American destroyers and the 600 or so men who crewed them had accomplished in a single night what months of broader campaign effort in the Central Solomons had struggled to achieve: a decisive, one-sided result that altered the strategic arithmetic of the entire theater without adding to the already heavy ledger of American dead. When the reports reached higher commands that morning, when admirals read the summaries and the numbers resolved themselves out of the fog of the night action, there was recognition of something qualitatively new. Not just a tactical success, not just a favorable exchange rate, a demonstration that the United States Navy had, in these waters, on this particular kind of night mission, learned something fundamental. The question now was whether it could repeat it, and whether the institution had the wisdom to understand why it had worked before the moment passed and the war moved on. The wreckage of 3 destroyers resting on the floor of Vella Gulf, the drums of supplies drifting somewhere on the surface above them, the garrison troops who would never reach Kolombangara, all of this constituted the true balance sheet of the night. One side had come away with nothing but loss, the other had come away whole. In a campaign defined by attrition, by the slow and costly accumulation of advantage through suffering on both sides, that kind of accounting was not merely significant, it was extraordinary. When the sun rose over Vella Gulf and the reports began filtering back through American command, officers did something they had not done. After many previous engagements in the slot, they looked at the numbers and simply could not find the catch. 3 Japanese destroyers destroyed, roughly 1,000 men lost, the resupply mission obliterated, and on the American side, the ledger read 0. No ships damaged, no sailors killed in the engagement itself. For men who had spent the better part of a year absorbing punishment in these waters, who had watched cruisers capsize and destroyers break apart and torpedo wakes slice through formations that never had a chance to respond, that 0 was not just a number. It was a question. What had Moosbrugger done differently, and why had it worked so completely when so much before it had gone so wrong? The answer begins not in the waters of Vella Gulf, but in the wreckage of earlier fights, because the Battle of Vella Gulf cannot be properly understood except in contrast with what preceded it. Tassafaronga, fought in the last days of November 1942, stands as the clearest mirror. An American cruiser force, numerically superior and equipped with radar, intercepted a Japanese destroyer column on a resupply run along almost exactly the same kind of mission profile as the one Moosbrugger's ships would face 9 months later. The Americans detected the Japanese ships first. They had the advantage of surprise, and they threw it away in almost every way a force could throw away an advantage, opening with gunfire that immediately revealed their position, massing their fire on a single target while ignoring the rest of the column, and fatally delaying their own torpedo launches, while Japanese destroyers reacting with practiced speed put their long-lance weapons in the water and devastated the American formation. 4 American cruisers were hit. 1 was sunk. The Japanese lost a single destroyer and still partially completed their resupply mission. It was, by any objective measure, a catastrophe dressed in partial credit. The institutional lessons drawn from Tassafaronga and engagements like it were uncomfortable precisely because they pointed not just at tactics, but at assumptions. American naval doctrine in the early war period had treated destroyers largely as accessories, screening elements for cruisers and battleships, useful for anti-submarine work and torpedo attacks in certain circumstances, but subordinate to the heavier combatants around them. This hierarchy shaped the way destroyer captains thought about their own ships and the way flag officers deployed them. When destroyers were given the chance to use their torpedoes, it was often within a tactical framework designed around protecting larger ships rather than maximizing the destroyer's own lethality. The result was that the one weapon American destroyers carried that could genuinely threaten Japanese warships at night, the torpedo, was consistently underused, mistimed, or compromised by the priority given to gun action. And in the slot at night, gun action was almost always the wrong choice to make first. What Moosbrugger understood, and what he built his entire plan around on the night of the 6th of August, 1943, was a reversal of that hierarchy, so complete it amounted to a different philosophy of warfare at sea. His destroyers were not escorts that night. They were the primary weapons of the engagement, and everything else, formation, timing, course, communication, and above all, restraint, was organized around giving those weapons the best possible chance to work. The 1st Division, Moosbrugger's own, would approach from an angle that placed the Japanese column between it and the open water, a geometric arrangement that gave his torpedoes the longest possible track across the enemy's path. The 2nd Division, under Commander Roger Simpson, would hold its position off the Japanese flank, ready to engage with gunfire, but only after the torpedoes had already struck. The sequencing was not incidental. It was the entire point. The separation of the torpedo attack from the gun action was the single most decisive tactical choice Moosbrugger made, And understanding why requires understanding what had gone wrong so many times before. When a ship opens fire with its guns at night, it announces itself with light and sound. Every muzzle flash is a position marker visible for miles. Every gun salvo tells the enemy exactly where to aim their own weapons, and in the case of a Japanese destroyer commander trained for night combat, that information could be acted upon in seconds. The long-lance torpedo did not need a perfect firing solution. It needed a bearing and a range, and Japanese crews could generate those from a muzzle flash faster than American fire control teams could shift targets. By holding his gun division back until the torpedo detonations had already done their work, Moosbrugger denied the Japanese column that crucial window of reaction time. They could not point their tubes at an enemy they had not yet detected. By the time they might have, the sea around them was already coming apart. The role of radar in enabling this sequence cannot be overstated. At Tassafaronga, American radar had been present and had detected the Japanese ships, but the information it generated had not been efficiently converted into firing solutions and coordinated action. There were delays, miscommunications, and a lingering uncertainty at command level about how aggressively to act on a radar contact that lookouts had not yet visually confirmed. Moosbrugger had no such hesitation. His ships tracked the incoming Japanese column with surface search radar for an extended period before the attack, building a precise picture of the enemy's course, speed, and formation. That picture was shared across both divisions with disciplined efficiency. Fire control teams had time to run their solutions not once but repeatedly, checking and refining. By the moment of release, the torpedo firing data was not a guess made under pressure. It was a product of sustained, systematic observation that radar made possible and that human discipline made actionable. That discipline, the willingness to hold fire, to wait, to resist the instinct to do something visible and immediate, is harder to achieve than any technical advantage, and easier to underestimate from a distance of decades. Aboard those 6 destroyers in the final minutes before the attack, men at their stations knew the Japanese column was close. Radar operators could see the returns. Lookouts could feel the proximity of contact in the tightened silence on the bridges around them. Every instinct, sharpened by months of service in a war zone, was pressing toward action. The urge to fire early, to take the shot before the moment might slip away, is not weakness, it is a reasonable response to the chaos and uncertainty of combat at night. What Moosbrugger's crews demonstrated was the rarer quality of collective trust. Trust in their commander, trust in the plan, trust that the torpedo solution being refined on the fire control plot was worth the few additional seconds it took to perfect. That trust was not accidental. It was a product of preparation, of clear orders, and of a commanding officer who had communicated his intentions with enough clarity that his captains knew exactly what they were waiting for and why. There is also the question of formation and what it represented about Moosbrugger's fundamental conception of the engagement. Earlier American destroyer actions had tended to cluster ships together or to integrate them into cruiser formations where their movements were governed by the larger vessel's needs. Moosbrugger's 2-division structure kept his ships separated enough to give the torpedo division a clean firing angle, while positioning the gun division to exploit whatever the torpedoes left standing. This was not a complex maneuver in concept, but it required that both division commanders understand the plan well enough to execute it independently if communications broke down, and that the ships themselves be handled with enough precision in the dark to arrive at their intended positions on schedule. The fact that they did, in confined waters, at night, against a moving target, speaks to weeks of preparation, and to crews who had absorbed their instructions thoroughly enough to act on them without moment-to-moment guidance from above. Comparing the Vella Gulf action to the failures that preceded it, one pattern emerges with particular clarity: the difference between reactive tactics and deliberate ones. At Tassafaronga and similar engagements, American commanders had found themselves reacting to the situation as it developed, responding to contact, improvising their approach, making decisions under the pressure of events already in motion. Moosbrugger dictated the terms of the engagement from its earliest stages. He chose when to make contact visible. He chose the geometry of the attack. He chose the sequence of weapons. He denied the Japanese the one thing that their training and their long-lance torpedoes depended upon: a moment of American confusion in which to operate. By the time the Japanese column knew it was under attack, the outcome had already been determined in the dark water between them. None of this happened in isolation. Moosbrugger had studied the after-action reports, absorbed the painful documentation of what had gone wrong in the slot, and had the institutional support of officers above him who understood that the old approach to destroyer tactics was producing avoidable losses. The Navy had been learning, painfully and at cost, through the entire Solomons campaign. What Vella Gulf represented was that learning reaching a point of application clean enough to produce a result without ambiguity. Not a partial victory claimed amid confusion, but a complete tactical execution from which every variable that could be controlled had been controlled. It was the distinction between knowing a lesson and having fully incorporated it into action, and it made the difference between the ledgers that had characterized the slot all year and the ledger that Moosbrugger's ships brought home before dawn on the 7th of August. The broader significance of what worked at Vella Gulf was immediately apparent to those within the destroyer community who understood its implications. Destroyers, handled correctly, with doctrine built around their actual strengths rather than inherited assumptions about their supporting role, could achieve results that larger and more expensive warships had failed to achieve in the same waters. The torpedoes worked when given the geometry and the time to work. Radar worked when the information it provided was acted upon with confidence and precision. Crews performed when given a plan clear enough to execute without improvisation and leadership steady enough to be trusted. These were not revelations that required extraordinary resources or exotic technology. They required an officer who grasped what his ships were actually capable of, built a plan that matched capability to circumstance, and then trusted his people to carry it out. In the grinding mathematics of the Pacific War, that kind of clarity was worth more than most things that could be ordered from a shipyard. The morning after Vella Gulf was quiet in a way that carried weight. The 4 destroyers that had set out from Rabaul with drums of rice and ammunition and the quiet assurance of a winning record would not be coming back. 3 of them were already settling into the floor of the Gulf, and the 4th had limped northward through the dark, trailing smoke and silence. On Kolombangara, the garrison troops who had been expecting those supplies waited through the night and then through the following day, and the ships they were waiting for never arrived. That silence, the absence of the familiar thunder of destroyer engines in the anchorage, the absence of drums bobbing in the shallows, was the first signal, though not yet understood in full, that something fundamental had shifted in the waters of the Central Solomons. At the headquarters level, the news of the catastrophe moved through Japanese naval channels with the controlled, careful language that institutions use when they are trying to absorb something they did not expect. 3 destroyers lost, hundreds of men gone, a resupply mission not merely failed but annihilated. The officers reading those dispatches understood immediately that this was not the kind of loss that could be absorbed as a tactical anomaly, the way earlier reverses had been explained away as bad luck or bad weather or unusual American aggression. This was a structural failure. The Americans had found the column in the dark, had known exactly where it was and what it was doing, and had destroyed 3/4 of it without suffering a single significant hit in return. The questions that followed were inevitable. How had the Americans known? How had they approached undetected? And what would happen the next time a destroyer column tried to run the slot? The answers that Japanese planners reached were not wrong, precisely, but they were incomplete. They understood that American radar had played a role, though the full sophistication of what Moosbrugger had done, the separation of torpedo attack from gun action, the geometry of the ambush, the disciplined use of a radar picture to dictate every variable of the engagement took longer to come into focus. What they grasped immediately was that the conditions that had made the Tokyo Express viable, the ability to move fast, in darkness, without detection, and to deliver a devastating torpedo attack of their own, if intercepted, could no longer be assumed. The darkness that had been their ally for months had become unreliable. And unreliable darkness was not darkness at all. The reluctance to commit destroyers to the slot without stronger protection began to manifest almost immediately. Planning sessions that in earlier months would have moved quickly from concept to execution now moved more slowly, with more questions asked and more voices raised about escort strength and route options, and the consequences of another encounter, like the one in Vella Gulf. This was not cowardice. The Japanese destroyer men who had operated the Tokyo Express were skilled, dedicated sailors who had proved their courage many times over. It was calculation. Sending fast destroyers alone into a channel where American radar could find them and American torpedo spreads could reach them in the dark had gone from a calculated risk to something closer to a reckless one, and the men responsible for those ships and those crews were aware of it. The confidence that had animated so many previous runs, the sense that speed and skill and darkness were enough, had taken a blow it would not entirely recover from. The immediate operational consequences for Kolombangara were severe. The island's garrison had been maintained through resupply runs that required the destroyers to move at pace, drop their drums, and be clear of the area before American air power could react at dawn. That rhythm depended on regularity, on the ability to run the slot at will. When that ability became contested, when every run had to be weighed against the possibility of another Vella Gulf, the rhythm broke down. Supplies that should have arrived in the first days of August did not arrive, or arrived late, or arrived in reduced quantities because the risk calculus had changed. The garrison on Kolombangara, already under pressure from American air attack and cut off from easy reinforcement, began to feel the slow tightening of isolation that a disrupted supply line produces. It was not a sudden collapse, it was a gradual narrowing of options. For the broader New Georgia campaign, the timing of the battle was significant in ways that compounded its immediate effect. American forces had been grinding through New Georgia for weeks, fighting through difficult jungle terrain toward the airfield at Munda Point, and the campaign had not gone as smoothly or as quickly as planners had hoped. The continued resupply and reinforcement of Kolombangara, the island just to the northwest, garrisoned strongly enough to serve as a base for Japanese counterpressure, had been a persistent complication. Vella Gulf did not end that complication overnight, but it altered the terms on which the Japanese could sustain it. A garrison that could be regularly reinforced and resupplied was a strategic asset. A garrison that could only be reached at increasing cost and uncertainty was something closer to a liability. The decision that would eventually crystallize this was the American choice to bypass Kolombangara entirely rather than assault it directly. This was not a decision taken immediately after Vella Gulf, and it was shaped by multiple factors: the difficulty of the New Georgia fighting, the lessons being drawn from island assaults more broadly, the growing confidence in the effectiveness of isolation as a strategy. But the isolation of Kolombangara that made bypassing it feasible was itself a product of the disruption to Japanese resupply that Vella Gulf had accelerated. An island whose garrison could be regularly resupplied and reinforced presents a different problem than one whose garrison is slowly running short of rice and ammunition and medical supplies, and the simple will that comes from knowing your side controls the sea lanes. Vella Gulf did not single-handedly starve the Kolombangara garrison, but it put that outcome within reach. The Japanese did not abandon the Tokyo Express concept entirely after Vella Gulf. The operational need was too pressing and the alternatives too limited for that. But the runs that followed were different in character. They were more cautious, more carefully weighed, sometimes escorted by additional warships that added to the logistical burden without necessarily adding enough combat power to change the radar equation. There were further attempts to push supplies through to the central Solomons garrisons, and some of those attempts succeeded. But the easy confidence of earlier months, the sense that the slot at night belonged to Japanese destroyers, was gone, and the operations that replaced it were costlier, harder, and less reliable. The Americans, having demonstrated what their destroyers could do when properly handled, had fundamentally changed the risk calculation for every future run. What happened to the Kolombangara garrison in the weeks and months following Vella Gulf traced a recognizable arc, cut off with increasing completeness from the supplies and reinforcement that would have been needed to sustain a fighting strength. The garrison was eventually evacuated rather than reinforced, a substantial operation carried out under pressure and at considerable cost. moving thousands of troops off an island that could no longer be held or supplied. That evacuation was itself a strategic defeat, the kind that does not produce dramatic images but represents a real and permanent loss of ground, of position, of the ability to threaten or complicate American advances up the island chain. The men who had been garrisoning Kolombangara had not been defeated in a pitched battle. They had been made irrelevant by the disruption of the line that kept them alive. The broader pattern that Vella Gulf accelerated was the unraveling of the Japanese ability to maintain forward garrisons in the Central Solomons at sustainable cost. The Tokyo Express had been the mechanism by which Japan held territory its ground forces could not hold without external supply. When that mechanism became unreliable, when the cost of running it spiked and the likelihood of loss on any given run increased, the forward garrisons it served became increasingly untenable. This was not purely a consequence of Vella Gulf. American air power, the slow improvement in American naval tactics across many engagements, the grinding pressure of the entire Solomons campaign, all contributed. But Vella Gulf was a concrete demonstration that the resupply problem was not going to improve, that the Americans were not going to be driven back by torpedo attacks in the dark the way they had been at Tassafaronga, and that the night itself was no longer a reliable protector. There is a particular kind of strategic consequence that comes not from a single dramatic reversal, but from the loss of confidence in a method. The Tokyo Express had worked for long enough and often enough that Japanese planners had built their forward position in the Solomons around the assumption that it would continue to work. When that assumption was broken, not just questioned, but broken in the specific, violent, irreversible way that Vella Gulf demonstrated, the entire structure of plans and deployments built on it became fragile. The garrison on Kolombangara, the supply schedules, the expectation of night supremacy in the slot, all of it rested, in part, on a belief that had been shattered in the time it took 24 torpedoes to run their course through dark water. What Moosbrugger and his 6 ships had done was not simply win a battle. They had invalidated an assumption, and the strategic consequences of that invalidation were far larger than the battle's immediate destruction. The men on those resupply ships had carried their drums of rice and their confidence in equal measure, and both had been consumed by the same engagement. What came after was the long, grinding consequence of that loss, the slower runs, the reduced supplies, the garrison that could not be sustained, the island that had to be abandoned rather than defended. Wars are not always decided in the moments that produce the most noise. Sometimes they turn on a quiet shift in what is possible and what is not, on the subtraction of a certainty that had been load-bearing. In the weeks after Vella Gulf, the Tokyo Express was still running, but it was running differently, more carefully, more expensively, less effectively. And the distance between what it had been and what it had become was the true measure of what one night's work had accomplished in the dark waters of the Central Solomons. The battle reports travelled faster than the destroyers themselves. Before Moosbrugger's 6 ships had even cleared the southern approaches and made for their anchorage, the signals were already moving up the chain of command, clipped. Factual dispatches that nonetheless carried the unmistakable charge of something unprecedented. 3 enemy destroyers sunk, no American ships damaged, no American lives lost in the engagement itself. The officers reading those figures in the early hours of the 7th of August, 1943, read them more than once. In a campaign that had trained American naval leadership to brace for the cost column, to measure victories against their price in hulls and men, these numbers arrived like a language no one quite knew how to pass. The instinct, after so many painful months in the slot, was to check for errors. There were none. Admiral Theodore Wilkinson understood immediately that what Moosbrugger had brought back was not simply a tactical victory, it was a proof of concept. Every element of the engagement, the radar approach, the divided formation, the torpedo strike launched before a single gun spoke, the disciplined silence held across the task group until the weapons were already in the water, had been executed with the kind of mechanical precision that most fleet doctrine treated as theoretical. Moosbrugger had made it actual. Wilkinson moved quickly to ensure that the record of how it had been done was preserved in a form that could be taught, not merely celebrated. The after-action report that came out of the battle was not a routine document. It was written with the care of men who understood they had witnessed something that needed to outlast the moment. Within weeks, the tactical analysis was circulating among destroyer squadron commanders across the South Pacific. The core lesson was simple enough to state, and extraordinarily difficult to have believed before Vella Gulf made it undeniable. Destroyers, operating as a coordinated strike force rather than as the outriders of heavier ships, could defeat an enemy night fighting force without absorbing a single retaliatory blow. The key was sequencing. Torpedo attack first, launch from an angle that denied the enemy a return solution. Gunfire second, only after the torpedoes had done their work and the enemy formation was already broken. What Moosbrugger had grasped, and what the earlier disasters in the slot had failed to teach because the lessons had never been applied cleanly enough to be legible, was that the two phases of a night surface action were not simultaneous. They were sequential. That sequencing was now doctrine. The practical implications ran deep into the way destroyer crews trained and thought about their weapons. For much of the early Solomons campaign, torpedo doctrine had been subordinated to the needs of the cruiser formations destroyers screened. Torpedo solutions were often delayed or abandoned in the chaos of general action, guns opened prematurely, and the Long Lance's devastating range advantage was handed to the Japanese by default. Moosbrugger's approach inverted that entirely. The torpedo was the primary weapon, the gun was the finisher. Training began to reflect this in exercises that drilled destroyer divisions on radar approach geometry, on holding fire discipline across multiple ships simultaneously, and on the kind of formation communication that allowed two divisions to act as a single coherent instrument in complete darkness. The sailors running those drills in the weeks after Vella Gulf were learning the shape of what had just been done in real water against a real enemy. Moosbrugger himself was characteristically reserved in the attention that followed. He was not a man who sought the broader light of public recognition, and the nature of destroyer warfare in the Pacific close, fast, often conducted far from the correspondence, and the cameras meant that the battle itself received only modest coverage in the press that reached American households. That suited him. His concern had always been narrower and more urgent, that the men who would fight the next engagement and the one after that understood what had worked and why. He made himself available to the conversations happening in the destroyer community with a directness that his reputation had already ensured would carry weight. When Moosbrugger said that radar discipline and torpedo sequencing had made the difference, people listened not because of rank alone, but because he had demonstrated it under fire. The engagement at Vella Gulf became a fixed reference point in the professional conversations of destroyer officers across the Pacific theatre. In the planning sessions and tactical discussions that preceded subsequent night actions, it was invoked the way a craftsman invokes a successful piece of work, not with reverence but with precision, as a standard against which new situations could be measured. What were the radar conditions? Was the formation geometry allowing for a clean torpedo approach before gun action commenced? Were the divisions coordinated well enough to hold fire discipline across the task group? These were the questions Vella Gulf had taught men to ask, and the battle's authority in those discussions came from the same source as all genuine tactical authority. It had worked, completely, in conditions that closely resembled what any future engagement might present. The formal recognition extended to Moosbrugger and his commanders was measured and appropriate to the culture of a navy at war, where ceremonies were brief and the next mission was always close. Decorations were awarded to the officers who had planned and executed the action. Squadron and division commanders received acknowledgement through the channels that the service used to signal that a performance had been noticed at the highest levels. But the more durable recognition was institutional rather than ceremonial. The Navy had a mechanism, imperfect and sometimes slow but ultimately functional, for absorbing the lessons that combat produced. Vella Gulf fed into that mechanism with unusual clarity, because the action had been clean in execution, clean in outcome, to make its lessons extractable without the usual noise of partial success and compound failure. What the Navy was absorbing, through that mechanism, was something more fundamental than a set of tactical procedures. It was a revised understanding of what a destroyer was for. Throughout the pre-war period and into the early Solomons campaign, The destroyer had been conceived primarily in relational terms. It existed in relation to larger ships, screening them, scouting for them, delivering messages between them. Its own offensive power was real, but treated as secondary, something to be used when circumstances permitted, rather than something to be planned around. Moosbrugger's action at Vella Gulf demonstrated, at scale and in conditions of genuine danger, that a destroyer formation acting on its own initiative, with its own fire control, its own radar picture, and its own doctrine, could be the decisive instrument in a surface engagement. That was a genuinely different thing from what the destroyer had been understood to be. The ripple from that understanding moved forward through the remaining years of the Pacific Campaign in ways that were not always directly traceable to Vella Gulf, but that bore its clear signature. Subsequent destroyer actions in the Central and Northern Solomons built on the tactical framework that Moosbrugger's battle had validated. Commanders planning night interceptions carried the Vella Gulf template into their calculations as something proven rather than theoretical. The discipline of radar-managed approach, of withheld gunfire, of torpedo attack, as the opening movement rather than the supporting one, these became the expected architecture of American destroyer night action in a way they simply had not been before the 7th of August, 1943. There is a particular kind of influence that operates quietly through professional communities, not through proclamation, but through the steady pressure of demonstrated example. Moosbrugger exercised that kind of influence. He had not invented the individual elements of what he did at Vella Gulf. Radar was not new. Torpedo doctrine had been discussed. The idea of a divided formation had tactical precedent. What he had done was assemble those elements into a coherent, disciplined whole and execute that whole under combat conditions with enough completeness that the result could not be attributed to luck. That was the contribution, and it was recognized as such by the people in the destroyer community who understood what recognition in that form meant. Not a monument, not a headline, a changed way of doing things. The men who had served under Moosbrugger carried something forward as well, not just doctrine, but a particular kind of professional confidence that comes from having done a hard thing well. Sailors who had stood at torpedo stations in the dark water of Vella Gulf, who had felt the ship's deck shake with the launches and then waited in silence for what the water would return, had learned something about what their training was capable of producing. That knowledge was not transferable through documents. It lived in the way a veteran answers a new man's question, in the steadiness of a crew that has been in contact and come out on the right side of it. The destroyers that continued operating in the Pacific carried veterans of Vella Gulf in their compartments and on their bridges, and those men shaped the culture of those ships in ways that no after-action report could fully capture. By the time the Pacific War reached its later and still larger phases, the destroyer force the United States Navy was operating had been transformed from the uncertain, doctrine-starved collection of ships that had suffered through the early Solomons campaign. Part of that transformation was material better torpedoes, more reliable fuses, more capable radar. But part of it was conceptual, a settled clarity about the destroyer's role and its offensive potential that had not existed before men like Moosbrugger had gone out into the slot and proved it in the dark. Vella Gulf was not the only source of that clarity, but it was one of the clearest because it had been one of the most complete a night action in which everything that was supposed to work had worked and nothing that was supposed to be protected had been lost. In a war full of complicated outcomes, that kind of simplicity was its own form of teaching. There are battles that stop the world. Battles fought in daylight, across open ground or open sea, where the scale of what is happening is visible to everyone involved and legible to history almost from the moment it begins. Midway, Stalingrad, El Alamein. These are the names that fill the chapters of survey histories, the names spoken in the same breath as turning points and transformation. And then there are the other battles, the ones fought in darkness, in narrow waters, by a few hundred men aboard a handful of ships that most people on either side of the war never heard of. The Battle of Vella Gulf was one of those. It happened in roughly an hour, in the dark waters of a sound that most Americans could not have found on a map, between forces small enough that the entire engagement would have been a footnote to a footnote at midway. But history does not award significance by weight or by audience. It awards significance by consequence, and the consequences of what happened in Vella Gulf on the night of the 6th of August, 1943, rippled outward in ways that no single participant could fully see from the deck of his ship. To understand what Vella Gulf meant, you have to return to where this story began, not to the battle itself, but to the years of fear and failure that preceded it. The slot had been a graveyard for American confidence long before it became a graveyard for Japanese steel. From the catastrophe off Savo Island in the summer of 1942, through the grinding attrition of the following months, through Tassafaronga and the other engagements where American ships and American sailors had paid a terrible price for institutional rigidity and tactical unpreparedness, the weight of defeat had accumulated. It accumulated not just in the casualty figures and the ship losses, but in the quieter, harder-to-measure toll it took on the men who survived, the officers who had watched their formations dissolve in the dark, the sailors who had been pulled from burning oil-slicked water and sent back to sea. By the time Commander Frederick Moosbrugger led his 6 destroyers into the slot in the summer of 1943, American destroyer men carried all of that history with them. They carried it because it was theirs, because the sea had given it to them, and because they had not yet found a way to put it down. What Moosbrugger's men brought back from Vella Gulf was something more valuable than a tactical victory, though the tactical victory was real and complete and unprecedented. They brought back the proof that the formula could be cracked. 3 Japanese destroyers sunk, nearly 1,000 men lost, not a single American ship scratched, not a single American life taken in the action itself. These numbers, when they were fully assembled and understood, did not just represent a successful interception, they represented a refutation. A refutation of the idea, which had settled like sediment into the lower decks of the Pacific Fleet, that Japanese destroyer men were simply better at this than their American counterparts. That the slot belonged to the Tokyo Express by some natural right, some innate quality of Japanese seamanship and aggression that could not be matched or overcome. Vella Gulf said otherwise, clearly and without qualification, and that rebuttal mattered as much as anything else the battle achieved. For the men aboard those 6 destroyers, the meaning of the night was more immediate and more personal than any strategic accounting. They had gone into the slot as men who knew the history of the slot, who knew what it had done to the ships and the sailors who had sailed it before them. They had prepared with unusual care, briefed with unusual precision, and followed a plan that demanded patience at exactly the moment when every combat instinct screams to act. And then the torpedoes had run, and the darkness had erupted, and within minutes the geometry of the engagement had resolved itself into something almost incomprehensibly complete. For the veterans among the crews, men who had watched earlier interceptions collapse into chaos, the silence that followed the detonations must have been difficult to fully process. They had done something that their service had struggled to do for more than a year. They had done it cleanly, and the sea had not taken any of them in return. But the sea had taken others. This is the weight that a closing account of any battle must carry honestly, because battles do not belong only to the victors, and the waters of Vella Gulf held more than wreckage on the morning of the 7th of August. They held men, Japanese sailors and soldiers, who had been aboard those destroyers not as combatants in the moment of impact, but as passengers, troops bound for Kolombangara, men who in many cases never had the chance to fight back against what killed them. The Tokyo Express had been many things: an efficient logistical system, a tactical threat, a symbol of Japanese naval resilience, but the men who rode it were men. They had their own histories, their own capacities for fear and endurance and hope, and the waters that swallowed them swallowed all of that too. Any accounting of what Vella Gulf achieved has to hold that knowledge alongside the pride in the victory, not to diminish the one but to honor the full truth of the other. The strategic consequences played out over the weeks and months that followed, and they were severe for Japan. The Kolombangara garrison, already stretched and under pressure, found itself increasingly cut off as Japanese commanders grew far more cautious about committing destroyers to resupply runs in the slot without stronger protection than they could readily provide. The Tokyo Express did not stop entirely, but it lost the easy confidence it had once moved with, the sense that the dark waters were a reliable highway rather than a hunting ground. And when the Allies eventually chose to bypass Kolombangara altogether rather than assault it directly, the isolated garrison was left in place, a force neutralized not by battle but by irrelevance. A consequence threading directly back to the night when the supply line was decisively broken. One engagement, correctly fought, had made an entire island's garrison strategically irrelevant, without another major landing being required. Within the American destroyer community, the lessons of Vella Gulf moved fast. Moosbrugger's tactical approach, the separation of torpedo attack from gun action, the use of radar to dictate the terms and the timing, the insistence on treating destroyers as strike weapons in their own right, rather than as escorts subordinated to cruiser lines, was studied and discussed and incorporated into doctrine with an urgency that previous battles had created the appetite for. The Navy's capacity to learn from experience had been tested severely in the Solomons, and Vella Gulf gave that capacity something genuinely worth learning from. The engagement became a reference point, a template, a demonstration that the ideas being argued about in briefing rooms and tactical publications could work in the dark against a skilled and determined enemy. That institutional learning was itself a kind of victory, one that extended far beyond Vella Gulf into the subsequent destroyer actions of the Pacific campaign. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that Vella Gulf happened at night, unseen by almost anyone outside the men who fought it. No journalists watched from a transport. No cameras recorded the torpedo wakes cutting through dark water, or the sudden vast light of magazines detonating aboard ships that had been sailing in confident formation seconds before. The battle produced no iconic images, no footage that could be replayed to illustrate the Pacific War's momentum shifting. It produced a brief operational report, some radar plots, and the testimony of the men who came back from it. Wars are full of moments like this, decisive, consequential, almost entirely unwitnessed, and the ones that happen in darkness are often the most honest representations of what war actually is. Not pageant, not spectacle. A handful of ships, a narrow sea, a decision made at the right moment, and then silence. The summer of 1943 was a season of accumulation in the Pacific. Each engagement added to a weight that was slowly, unevenly tipping the balance. The grinding campaigns in New Guinea, the air battles over the Solomons, the slow, painful advance through the island chain that had claimed so much American effort and so many American lives since the landing at Guadalcanal the previous year. No single action decided the campaign, and it would take another 2 years and enormous additional sacrifice before the war in the Pacific concluded. But within that long arc, Vella Gulf occupies a specific position the moment when American destroyer forces demonstrated conclusively that they had found the answer to what had been defeating them, that the painful education of the preceding year had produced something that could be deployed with precision and devastating effect. The Express had been running on time for too long. One night changed that permanently. Moosbrugger himself remained a relatively quiet figure in the public narrative of the war. He was decorated, his command recognized, but he belonged to the category of officers who left their mark on institutions rather than on headlines, whose contribution was absorbed into doctrine, into training, into the way his service thought and operated, rather than being attached to a name that became famous. That is perhaps the most fitting legacy for a man who fought a battle in the dark with no audience. The Navy he served became measurably better at destroyer warfare because of what he and his crews demonstrated in Vella Gulf. And that improvement compounded over the remaining years of the conflict in ways that cannot be precisely measured but cannot be reasonably doubted. The quiet legacies are often the deep ones. Vella Gulf does not appear in many accounts of the Second World War outside of specialist histories. The slot, the Tokyo Express, the grinding back and forth of the Solomon Islands campaign, these are subjects that belong to the devoted reader rather than to the casual survey. And yet the battle encapsulates something essential about how wars are actually decided. Not always by the largest forces or the most dramatic confrontations. Not always by the generals and admirals whose names history engraves most deeply. Sometimes by the right plan, executed with exceptional discipline by men who had learned from failure and were ready to apply what they had learned at the exact moment when it mattered most. 6 ships, a dark gulf, 24 torpedoes in the water, and then the silence after, carrying everything that had just changed. The waters of Vella Gulf are quiet now. The slot is not a killing ground anymore. Somewhere beneath that surface, the wreckage of 3 Japanese destroyers lies in the dark, as it has lain for more than 80 years, a memorial without a marker, a record kept by the sea alone. The men who sank them came home, most of them, and lived the rest of their lives with what they had done and what they had survived. The men who went down with those ships never came home at all. Both facts are true, and both belong to the story. What happened in Vella Gulf on that August night was not the end of anything by itself, but it was part of the slow, irresistible accumulation of moments that would eventually end everything. One night, 6 ships, and the tide turning quietly in the dark.